1 2 1 2.
There we go.
1 2 1 2.
1 2 1 2. Check yours.
Check here. Hello, hello.
Yeah. Going to start in just a couple of minutes, so if you could make yourselves comfortable, we'll get underway soon. Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome, and it is wonderful to see you in person, this being the third Transform event of the year. I've had the privilege of moderating the last two, but they were online, so it's really wonderful to see you in person today, and a very warm welcome on behalf of the European Alliance for Transformative Therapies, Transform MEP Interest Group, to this conference to launch the Charter for EU cooperation to enable safe and timely patient access to advanced therapies in Europe. And this event is organised under the auspices of the Czech presidency of the European Union. My name is Jackie Davis, for those who have not been at our previous event, and I will be moderating. I'm going to start with a short series of keynotes, just to set some context for our discussion, and then some interactive panels as we consider how best to realise the full potential of life-saving and life-transforming therapies, drawing on recommendations contained in the Charter that is being launched today. You're going to hear more about the Charter later on. It also will be available on the Transform website. A bit of housekeeping before I introduce our host for today. The event is being live streamed for those who cannot join the event in person, and it is being recorded, and it will be put on the Transform website. If you would like to tweet out about what you are hearing here today, and we do encourage you to get that message out, please use the hashtags MEPs for ATMPs, and Transform themselves will be live tweeting during the event, and you can engage with the Twitter handle at Transform_CGT. If you would like to raise a question, and I'm delighted to say this, you don't have to click on a button and write. You can, in the old-fashioned way, raise your hands, and when the time comes, I will ask you to activate your mic, little red button in front of you for those who are not familiar with the Parliament system, and after you speak I would ask you to turn your mic off again. This enables the cameras in the room to find the right person at the right time. And last but not least, but probably most importantly, we do invite you to join us for a little drink, a little reception to mark the launch of the Charter after we finish proceedings today, so we do hope you can join us. It's now my great pleasure to see in person and to give the floor to Andrzej Notek, MEP, who is co-chair of the Transform MEP Interest Group and a member of the European Parliament's Environment, Public Health and Food Safety Committee. Andrzej, thank you so much for having us, and over to you.
Many thanks, Jackie, for the floor. It is also a pleasure to see you physically, to meet you after the virtual era. And now let's get started. So, very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, honorable colleagues, distinguished guests. It is a real pleasure to welcome you here at the European Parliament on behalf of the MEP Interest Group for Transformative Therapies. And yes, indeed, this is the day. This is the day we have been so much looking forward, because we are today about to launch our charter, the Charter for EU cooperation to enable safe, and timely access to EU patients to advanced transformative therapies. The MEP International Interest Group for the Transformative Therapies is a group of members of the European Parliament from various political groups and also nationalities, but with one common goal. And this is to use the full potential of advanced therapeutical medicine products. So these therapies that are so innovative, high-tech, but as well life-transforming, and not only to use their potential, but also to simply to enhance the access of a patient to those therapies. And often we are talking about patients that are suffering from such conditions where there are no other alternatives than usage, for example, of applying of cell and gene therapies. And this is also the reason why such therapies simply cannot be underestimated or overlooked in the future. We have been working for some time, and of course we are somehow halfway through. The reality is indeed much more complicated. There are a number of burdens. Let's say that the patients are ready, but we are still not able to simply deliver and meet their needs. And this is the reason why under so-called Transform Alliance, it's not only about the MEP Interest Group who, as MEPs, we try to understand what we can do, and we can promote this topic, but we have been working in last months with a number of experts within the Transform Alliance, all different stakeholders interested in the topic, interested in the bills, of course, first of all, with the patients' organization representing the patients, with researchers, with businesses, with healthcare providers, doctors, regulators, national experts, with all and together to have one clear goal to define, let's say, not ideology-driven, but professional political recommendations that, if they are put forward and addressed in legislation, they can enhance the access and at the same time not to disturb the sustainability of the healthcare ecosystems in terms of the budget. Now, at these times, we are in very interesting times because number of health-related legislation is being novelized, and of course we are now in ideal opportunity to address the concrete recommendations in a number of concrete legislations. I have been talking about the Charter, so there are 7 policy recommendations, and one of them is the key one, which is, in my shortcut, patients first. So they should be in the center, and all the system around should be dynamic, flexible, shall react on all the different challenges and needs. The others, and I believe they will be discussed deeply in our panels, are the regulatory requirements for ATMPs, the use of real-world evidence to address uncertainties of cell and gene therapies, the EU Health Technological Assessment Regulation and its implementation, sharing best practice on a newborn screening, testing and diagnostics, new access pathways to support healthcare systems, sustainability and cross-border access. So those are headlines of our policy recommendations. Of course, behind there is much more deeper knowledge and ideas. I'm so proud that we are so many here sharing the same idea. I'm really looking forward for fruitful debate. Let's enjoy. Let's cooperate and let's share the ideas. Many thanks for being here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andre. And Andre will also be joining us for the second panel. So if you have any questions for him, you will be able to put them then. So underlining there why this issue matters so much, why it's so important, and this ideal moment, this ideal opportunity, as you said, to shape the policy landscape for addressing these issues, these challenges, while, as you said, ensuring the sustainability of healthcare systems, how we do that. That's all the things the Charter contains. Recommendations, as you said, 7 of them, headline recommendations, lots more detail. We will go through them in our panels. We have 2 panels. The first will be on future-proofing the EU's regulatory framework to accommodate innovative therapies, and the second, new approaches to foster safe and timely patient access to ATMPs in Europe. I'll tell you more about all of that later on, but now you said patients first, patients at the heart, and the Charter has, as its central core, create a dynamic patient-centric innovation ecosystem to address areas of medical needs. So we're going to start where we should, with the patient. And I am delighted to welcome Luke Pembroke, who is a haemophilia and rare disease patient advocate, and he's going to talk to us about the potential of innovative treatment options for the patient community. Luke, wonderful to have you with us. Over to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. So, I was asked to share my experience over the last few years, and it's a lot to condense in, but I will do my best. So, my name is Luke Pembroke, and I was born with a rare blood disorder called haemophilia, which affects my blood's ability to clot. If you want more information on the science, Google. Okay, next slide, please. So, my mum recalls that the day I was diagnosed with haemophilia, it felt like her world was falling apart. Further tests revealed my mum was not a carrier of haemophilia B, and in my case, it was the result of a spontaneous mutation. The doctor at the time said to my mum, "You had more chance of winning the lottery, Miss Pembroke." Talk about good bedside manner. Access to information back then was not as easy as it is today, where we have the internet at the tip of our fingers. And my mum knew very little about haemophilia, but she'd heard about the contaminated blood product scandal, and she'd read in dated medical encyclopedias that haemophilia was going to impact me on a severe level and limit my ability to lead a normal life. And then just before I turned 3 years old, my dad walked out on us. My mum was scared and alone. Despite her fear of needles and injections, my mum learnt to treat me with my factor replacement medicines, a life-saving medicine essentially. And this prevented internal bleeding as much as possible, or treated internal bleeds when they happened, unfortunately an inevitability at the time. And my mum recalls that throughout this process, doctors spoke often about the promise of gene therapy. It was only in the near future, and it looked promising, and it was always only 5 years away. Next slide, please. As I grew up with my condition, I reflected on what my mum had been told, and I figured it was a way for doctors to give my mum some element of hope, something that we could latch on to as we both learned to become experts at managing my haemophilia. And eventually I just figured that gene therapy wasn't close to being a reality, not in my lifetime anyway, or that I would be an old man in a rocking chair and I'd see on the news, gene therapy, it's finally happened, they've figured it out for haemophilia. So I got on with my life with haemophilia. I learned to live with it, I had to. Unfortunately, internal bleeding meant that I ended up with permanent damage in my ankle joints. I missed out on playing football and rugby with my friends, which, as you can imagine, is sort of a big deal growing up in the UK. And my veins suffered a real beating as I learnt to inject myself. I resented my haemophilia at times, I'll admit that. I'd often despair as a teenager, why me? Why did I have to have this? Next slide, please. Anyway, as I matured and gained some perspective and realised that haemophilia didn't have to dominate my life, I learned to relate more positively to my condition, and I got involved in the bleeding disorders community, advocating for myself and others. It's enabled me to travel and meet some fantastic people and experience what haemophilia care is like in other less fortunate parts of the world. I do a lot of work supporting new parents and younger people with haemophilia. So I figured my veins had already taken quite a beating, so it's actually quite easy for new parents to practice on me. So I'd often tell people that I don't live with haemophilia. Haemophilia lives with me, and I made peace with my condition. which I think was very important for what I was about to do next. Next slide, please. 11th of February 2020, arguably the most life-changing day of my 28 years on this planet. Never did I imagine that at the age of 25, I'd be heading to my haemophilia centre to receive gene therapy as part of a clinical trial. Now, granted, the decision-making process leading up to that point was very long and thoughtful, it has to be. But when the day of dosing actually arrived, part of me was still in disbelief. I remember sitting in the back of the cab on the way into the haemophilia centre and thinking, is this really happening? Am I actually getting gene therapy? It was all a bit surreal. That light at the end of the tunnel that had been promised to my mum all those years ago. Now, of course, taking part in a gene therapy trial is no walk in the park. It requires significant contemplation, commitment, and sacrifice. Understanding the prospect of gene therapy in a clinical trial setting requires you to carefully consider potential risks and be prepared for any outcome. In my mind, there were no guarantees, but I was confident in my decision to take part. And there were many reasons I wanted to. I won't go into all of them today, but compared to many in the worldwide community, I felt that I had a pretty fortunate experience growing up with haemophilia, and here was an opportunity for me to do something really significant for the community. Naturally, I'll admit that I hoped for a good, positive result as well, but I was prepared if this wasn't the case. I had to be aware of that. So I've shared my gene therapy trial experience in quite a lot of perhaps too much detail online, so I won't go into all the nitty-gritty now due to time constraints. But the first year of that clinical trial was hands down the toughest thing I've had to do in my life. And I'd grown up with haemophilia, so yeah, it turns out that going through a clinical trial whilst on high doses of immunosuppression during a global pandemic is quite the test, both physically and mentally. But I'm very glad that I had the top experts at my haemophilia centre taking care of me. And of course, I had a lot of loving support from friends and family who kept me just about sane on FaceTime and Xbox Live whilst I was shielding away from the rest of the world. So I couldn't have done it without the people closest to me in my life. Next slide, please. So fast forward to today. This is the good stuff everyone wants to know. How has gene therapy changed things? So what has changed? I no longer require regular factor infusions. I haven't had to inject myself with my old medicine since I received gene therapy, whereas in the past I was injecting myself 3 times a week. I don't worry about the risk of spontaneous bleeding anymore, and I bump my knee or elbow. I'm a clumsy person. I'll walk into furniture all the time, and a bruise might appear, and then a few days later it just heals and gets better, just like a normal person, whatever a normal person is, and no treatment is needed. I no longer think about my haemophilia on a daily basis, and I think that's the biggest thing. I feel mentally liberated from my condition. We can talk about all the numbers and data and the factor levels, but ultimately that mental impact on not having to worry about my haemophilia as much as I did is life-changing. And so earlier this year I got to spend 2 months living at a research camp in the Amazon rainforest. I hiked the Inca Trail, and I went on a Canadian road trip exploring the national parks. And haemophilia was the furthest thing from my mind, which when I travelled in the past, I was always thinking about my haemophilia. I was focused on avoiding bears, not internal bleeds. So, as cliche as it sounds, gene therapy has truly changed my life. And when I share my trial experience, people often say, "You're extremely brave for taking part, Luke." Personally, I wouldn't call myself brave. I consider myself very lucky. Lucky to have access to such a huge opportunity, and fortunate to be one of the first people to take the step. And I'm grateful to have played a small part in advancing the research of genetic medicine. We don't get to choose where or when we are born. It's the lottery of life, right? I'm lucky to have been born in the UK, a developed European country. Sadly not part of the EU anymore, but I won't get into that. Nevertheless, it is a country that plays host to these pioneering trials, centres of excellence, and top experts. Where you were born should not restrict the opportunity to access ATMPs, whether through a clinical trial or in an approved setting. These innovative treatments should be made available for everyone, not the fortunate few. With the announcement of the Transform Charter, I was really delighted to see patient centricity at the core of the recommendations, because this is what it's all about. It's about the patients, it's about getting these treatments to people. I'm pleased to see the limitations of the current regulatory system recognised, and there really is enormous potential to create more equitable access to advanced therapeutics across the EU through cross-border care, partnerships, and sharing of expertise. The EU epitomises the spirit of collaboration and cooperation, and with its members' combined efforts, I truly hope to see more patients' lives changed in the future, just how mine has been. Thank you very much.
Luke, thank you so much for sharing such a moving and heartwarming experience. You said you don't consider yourself brave, but frankly, that's one of the most inspiring and courageous statements I've heard in a long time, and it reminds us why what we are talking about today matters so much, that others can share what Luke has experienced, and it's so good to see those pictures of you having a wonderful time. If you do have any questions for Luke, he is going to stay with us all afternoon, so during the panels, if you did want to ask him something, and also you'll be here in the coffee break if anyone wants to. But Luke, thank you. I can't thank you enough. You've really underlined, as I say, why what we're talking about matters so very much indeed. Let us now get a view from a policymaker, from the Czech EU presidency, the role of ATMPs in a strong European Union health union. And Luke talked there about the importance of the EU here. Tomáš Boran, Director of the Marketing Authorization Section at the State Institute for Drug Control. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to first thank Transform for inviting me for this venue, and I would like to share my position from the National Regulatory Agency, but also from my expertise, as I was almost 8 years a member of Committee for Advanced Therapies at EMA. Now I switched to another committee, to Pediatric Committee, with my expertise. So I can say that also we regulators share the same problems and challenges. Maybe it's not visible, but I'm happy that we started with a patient perspective. Of course, we know that in the pipeline there are so many advanced therapy products, especially gene therapy products, not only for orphan diseases like hemophilia or, for example, another expected treatment will be for Duchenne muscular dystrophy in maybe 2024 to 2025. But also for more common diseases. For example, there is in pipeline a gene therapy for the treatment of diabetic peripheral neuropathy. And also we can see a big amount of products at EMA level, where from 69 products which were granted prime eligibility, it means it's status for priority medicines for unmet medical needs, which have some extended support from EMA. And from those 69 products, there is 30 gene therapy products. So it's really big amount. But unfortunately, nowadays we have only 16 advanced therapy medicinal products authorized within EU, compared, for example, to 25 in United States. And what is even less fortunate, that even some of marketing authorization were withdrawn or didn't came into life. So, for example, I was present at Committee for Advanced Therapies in days when first gene therapy was authorized, which later didn't came into real life, and the same fate was for first cell therapy, which still exists in the United States, the Sipuleucel T. Also, that medicinal product has marketing authorization doesn't mean much, because from those 16 products, we can say that only 6 of them are used. It means they are, for example, marketed in more than 10 member states, but still there are almost half of member states which has 4 and less marketed advanced therapy medicinal products, and even there are still some member states where are no marketed ATMP. I just checked yesterday actual data, and it's really not nice. So such initiatives are really very important. And what is also important that usually advanced therapy medicinal products are developed at academic level, and in some time point they need to be transferred into phase 3 trials, which of course are financially expensive, so they need some investors, and also they need some investments into moving to marketing authorization. And what is very important to have early communication also with HTA bodies, because it's really frustrating when the marketing authorization holder has data for marketing authorization, but later he hears that, okay, but those data are not enough to consider any kind of reimbursement. So that's why this point, which is also in those recommendations, is very and really very important, because bad communication between HTA and medicinal agencies can even delay coming those products into market. Another problem is that even compared to United States, the marketing authorization process is longer and less predictable than, for example, in the United States, and there is also need for build better capacity of assessors at the EMA level, which can be kind of problematic. As you know, there are not so many experts in the field of advanced therapies, and of course for assessors you need to avoid conflicts of interest. So there is need to have a well-educated staff, and I hope there will be launched some EU-funded project to increase capacity of European Medicines Regulatory Network to have better trained staff, to have also much faster approval of advanced therapy medicinal products. Also, EMA just launched, I think a few days ago, a pilot project to support academia with development of advanced therapy medicinal products, and also in June this year ended EU-funded project called STARS. The acronym STARS is for strengthening of training of academia in regulatory science, which also should increase knowledge of academia how to develop medicinal products, including advanced therapy, which can be important, for example, if even at the stage of non-clinical trials, if academia will avoid mistakes, it again can make early availability of advanced therapy medicinal product. What is also important, there is not like general revision of legislation directly dedicated to advanced therapies, but each piece of legislation can help timely and safely access to ATMPs. For example, if we are speaking about EHDS, European Health Data System, data space, it can be important for use of secondary data and make good background, for example, for following the national course of disease in case, for example, of single-arm trials. Maybe that's really problematic to find patients, especially for orphan diseases, who would be able to attend clinical trials with placebo arm. So even HTA requires randomized controlled trials. I think for the future it's not feasible, and we need some strong registries that we can make even robust evidence from single-arm trials. And also what is really needed, and I saw it also from some discussions papers, for example, from FPA, that we have now new clinical trials regulation, but still we see decrease of clinical trials of gene therapy in Europe compared to US, which is maybe because of non-harmonized approach in different member states for GMO approval, because one part is clinical trial approval, but another part is GMO approval. It means a deliberate release of GMO. And now we have lessons learned from COVID-19, as it was possible to remove vaccines against COVID-19 from GMOs for a specific period of time. And that's true that usually AAV vectors, which are usually used for gene therapy, are considered safe. And at least I'm maybe not even removing it from GMO, but somehow harmonize it across Europe. And for example, if once it was approved in some member state, it could be transferred to another. So this really could help also to development of gene therapies. It was mentioned here, we need to consider that also clinical trials is one way how to access gene therapy. And what is also important, clinical trials are important also for the medical staff, that they know how to use it in the future, because using of gene therapy is sometimes much more complicated. It often needs also some technical equipment, for example, for pharmacies, if they need, for example, to prepare the medicine before application in laminar boxes or in some biosafety level. And also it needs educated staff. For example, some of future gene therapy will have specific kind of administration, like, for example, intra-brain applications or some different kinds. And also we are not speaking only about AAV vectors, but also we have in pipeline different products also in the field of tissue engineering products, like combination with nanomaterials and stem cells, or in the field of somatic cell therapy. There is big potential of induced pluripotent stem cells, and in gene therapy there are even some products in the pipeline based on genome editing. So yeah, the pipeline is very rich. And also we regulators must be prepared, not only at the level of guidelines, but also at the level of legislation. And we really need some harmonized approach within Europe. And I hope that those discussions where patients, politicians, regulators are involved, and of course representatives of pharma companies. So thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Tomasz. Thank you. And underlining some of those really serious challenges that need to be addressed, and they're all issues, speaking about many of the problems that the recommendation in the Charter are designed to tackle. We're going to hear more about those in a little while. But it's now my pleasure to give the floor to Victor Martins, who is Government Affairs Manager at EUCOPE, the European Confederation of Pharmaceutical Entrepreneurs. He's replacing his Secretary General, who unfortunately, Dr. Natz, who couldn't be with us. But Victor, it's wonderful to have you here to talk about solutions across the R&D life cycle to build a European system fit for transformative therapies. Over to you.
Thank you, Jackie. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and honourable MEPs, thank you for joining us today. It's an absolute privilege to be here. As Jackie said, I'm here to represent EUCOPE. I have written a bunch of things I was going to say, but obviously being last means a lot has been said. So I've been scribbling away, and I'm going to do my best to be coherent. But there's a good chance I might jump around a little bit as we go. But I think before I say anything else, I think I'd like to start off by thanking all the members of Transform, all of the patient communities, the clinical societies that have been involved as we've gone through this. Because I think that is one of the things that Transform does, is by bringing together these different perspectives, hopefully we can look for some solutions to shared challenges and try to chart a path forward. Cell and gene therapies represent an extraordinary, newish at this point, frontier, and bring incredible potential. But to take advantage of this, I think more and more we need to look at what works, but also what challenges exist both at national and at EU level, and see how we can overcome those. And it's going to represent an important shift in how we approach treatment, especially with a potential one-off application. meaning that we have to rethink perhaps how we pay for these kind of treatments, how the healthcare systems work with these treatments, and how we balance sustainability and a continued drive for long-term innovation. And this is, I think, one of the areas where Transform can play an important role in charting forward a path together. Today's conversation is taking place at, I think, an incredibly important and critical moment for us here, looking from a Brussels and EU perspective, and looking at the healthcare environment more broadly. As slowly we see more and more of these ATMPs come to market, unfortunately we're also seeing a decrease in the number of clinical trials being done here in Europe, as Thomas reflected on. And I think here again, while Europe has taken some steps, important steps, we've looked at the clinical trial regulation, we've looked at how we can improve harmonization, how we can potentially look at some of the GMO considerations. There's more to be done, and hopefully the Charter lays out some ways we can do this together. But it's not all doom and gloom. I think there's also some unique opportunities in front of us, and especially being here in the Parliament, maybe it's important to reflect on some of the opportunities we see ahead of ourselves. We've got the general pharmaceutical legislation, orphan legislation, paediatrics legislation, and SOHO legislations all coming. And I think those are going to be important elements where we can look at some of these challenges and hopefully drive innovation and, more importantly, access, like we said, being at the centre of this conversation. And I just want to pause and say there's obviously things we need to do there, but there's things we can do beyond that as well. We don't just need to look at the legislative framework. I want to point that out just because of the place we're sitting today. Ultimately, innovation, access, and the development of novel therapies takes place on a spectrum. Making a small change in one place or in another will have a ripple-on effect and change other things as well. So especially in any kind of innovation, but especially in ATMPs, it's important to take that holistic perspective when we look at the healthcare space, at the development process. And I'm glad to see that's what we've done through Transform as well. In policy, as we've laid out today, we've looked at the full life cycle of ATMPs, and hopefully that's what we can keep doing moving forward as this partnership. To facilitate access and to continue driving innovation, we need to remain globally competitive as a European region, to both drive innovation, research, and access. And this will require us, again, to take that holistic perspective, reflect on the system as a whole, and not at the expense of itself. We need to look at what works. We need to make sure we have a future-proof system, and a system that is tailored and reflective of the unique elements that ATMPs bring and have. I think cell and gene therapies bring a lot of hope, but there's a number of barriers we still need to overcome. I think as Transform as an alliance, it's a great forum to address some of these elements, and hopefully we'll bring them forward today. I think some of the points we've already pointed at, I think Thomas, I'm glad to hear from the regulatory perspective as well. There's been some recognition of some of those challenges. I just want to point out the early dialogue as well is especially important for some of those smaller, mid-sized companies to make sure that we can address these challenges as early as possible and make sure we bring them forward. The RCT example as well, I think, is incredibly important, so I'm glad to hear we seem to be looking at similar challenges together. But ultimately, I think none of this is going to be done by ourselves. I think, as I've said several times now, is that multi-stakeholder dimension that hopefully we can start looking for some solutions together. So I'm very happy we could be here today. I think we've got a great group of speakers and hopefully some great insights. So I just want to thank again the Alliance for all of the work, for working together, and hopefully we can keep that moving forward and bring forward practical, concrete, and actionable solutions. And with that, Jackie, hopefully I've been short enough.
You've been brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you, Victor. And that multi-stakeholder dimension, which so much, as you say, lies at the heart of this alliance and the approach and the recommendations that you have developed. Thank you very much. We will come back. We will talk about that. And as you pointed out, very important to emphasise, we are, of course, because of where we are, focusing a lot on the legislative framework, but this goes far beyond that in terms of some of the things that can and need to be done. I'm sure they will come up during our discussions. But before we go any further, I'd like to thank you. You may return to the comfy seats and relax. Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Andre. We'll hear from you later, Andre. Thank you, Tomasz. Thank you again, Victor. We want to show you a video. And this is the moment of launching the Charter. You've had some little snippets in our opening interventions, but now members of the Transform MEP Interest Group are going to take you through its key recommendations. So let's watch that video.
Today, the Transform MEP Interest Group launches its charter
Can we do anything about
with recommendations
volume?
for EU cooperation to enable safe and timely access to advanced therapy medicinal products, so-called ATMPs. The charter is the product of our work for the past 2 years, together with experts in the multi-stakeholder Transform Alliance, to identify the barriers faced by the patients to access the ATMPs, and to propose concrete solutions to those barriers at EU level. We want to ensure Europe remains an attractive environment to invest in innovation so that the patients can have early access to these innovative therapies.
ATMPs represent a new era of medicine, having the potential to change patient lives. ATMPs offer the hope of moving from chronic treatments that manage symptoms to long-lasting benefit, or even one-time treatments which can be potentially life-changing. However, our healthcare systems need to be more patient-centric and prepared to receive the revolution so that the cell and gene therapies are accessible to patients across Europe. Adequate incentives, a future-proof regulatory environment, appropriate pricing and reimbursement processes, and innovative access pathways are key. The Commission's ambition of a strong EU health union must reflect the patient voice in all decision-making, so that access to the best standard of care is not limited to the few. With a review of the EU pharmaceutical legislation, now is the time to act for the changes that are needed to make sure no European is left behind in the fight for better quality of life. We will now introduce our 7 recommendations.
I fully endorse the Transform MEP Interest Group Charter, in particular the recommendation to create a dynamic, patient-centric innovation ecosystem to address areas of medicinal need. The development pathway for ATMPs must reflect the needs and perspectives of patient and caregiver throughout the life cycle. From how clinical trials are designed to how evidence on ATMPs effectiveness is generated and how this is taken into account in value assessments. More collaboration and early iterative dialogue with effective involvement of patients and healthcare providers, as well as universities, developers, payers and research centres, will support the appropriate identification of development priorities for tomorrow's therapies. Underpinning this must be an attractive environment for clinical trials and an adequate incentives framework, encouraging developers to invest in R&D in the European Union. More clinical trials in Europe for ATMPs will mean patients can assess these treatments sooner, with the potential of improved health outcomes.
Hello. I endorse the Transform MEP Interest Group Charter, and in particularly welcome the recommendation to define appropriate regulatory requirements for the development of ATMPs. ATMPs are complex therapies requiring skilled production, assessment, distribution, and administration. A robust, proportionate regulatory framework must be in place to safeguard patient safety and confidence in innovative treatment options. The current proposal for a regulation of substance of human origin must preserve consistent and harmonized definitions for the classification criteria for blood, tissues, and cells, keeping a clear boundary with ATMPs, which are far more regulated. The forthcoming revision of the general pharmaceutical legislation must support this clear distinction. We call for more transparency and consistency around the use of the hospital exemption across the member states. With EU oversight via regulatory guidelines on quality, with equivalent standards for use, and a central European register for transparency on its use. All patients deserve safe, quality treatments and the EU must ensure all medicine developers are subject to same proportionate surveillance.
I endorse the Transform MEP Interest Group Charter, and in particular the recommendation to consider the use of real-world evidence to address uncertainties for ATMPs. Due to the nature of ATMPs as well as practical and ethical limitations, traditional pathways for clinical data collection are not always a feasible approach to generate robust and appropriate evidence. Real-world evidence as well as patient-report outcomes are therefore important when assessing ATMP's efficacy over time and can contribute to the implementation of outcomes-based agreements. The proposed European health data space is a crucial opportunity to ensure relevant data can be safely collected, shared, and used for this purpose, whilst always upholding the privacy of patients and their families. Ensuring data interoperability and setting standards for health data sets is vital to ensure it can be integrated into existing systems. The EU should also consider a dedicated EU fund for real-world evidence collection to help build the infrastructure needed to support the role of real-world evidence in the full life cycle of ATMPs.
I endorse the Transform MEP Interest Group Charter, in particular the recommendation to realise a European health technology assessment system that supports safe and timely patient access to advanced therapies, also known as cell and gene therapies. The new EU regulation marks an important milestone in cooperation between Member States on health technology assessments, which are assessments of the effectiveness, value and impact of new medicines. The hope is to reduce duplication at national level and get these innovative treatments to patients faster. As the regulation is implemented in the coming months and years, we must ensure that the promise of more streamlined reviews in the EU is fulfilled. Cell and gene therapies will be one of the first categories of new medicines subject to EU assessments under this new and very promising regulation indeed, starting in 2025. Given that cell and gene therapies are complex, specialised medicines, the EU assessments must use appropriate methodologies that recognise their unique characteristics. All relevant parties must be involved in the processes outlined in the regulation to ensure this new piece of legislation is fit for purpose and improves the time to access for patients.
I have the pleasure today to support and endorse the Charter of the European Alliance for Transformative Therapies. All these recommendations are of course essential, but I wish today to highlight one specifically: our call for greater sharing of best practices on newborn screening, testing and diagnostics. For many conditions, especially the rare and complex ones, time to diagnosis and treatment is a matter of life and death. Whilst rules around screening and testing are, of course, a national competence, we do need European guidelines on newborn screening, genetic testing and diagnostics. These guidelines should be included in a much needed and wider European action plan on rare diseases, which the Parliament has tirelessly been asking for. The European Reference Network's expert platform for newborn screening could support this work and position the European Union as a central point for information, for sharing good practices from existing national programs. A concrete, very concrete example of European solidarity in action to the benefit of all.
I endorse the Transform MEP Interest Group Charter, in particular the recommendation to promote new access pathways to support sustainability of healthcare systems. Finding new ways to work together as Member States in pricing and reimbursement, which is a national competence, requires new ways of thinking to unlock access for more EU citizens to ATMPs. Existing regional collaborations provide constructive lessons on how Member States have cooperated in a range of areas like horizon scanning, health technology assessments, and pricing and reimbursement discussions. We call on the EU to support national governments to share learnings on novel payment and risk-sharing models and funding approaches for ATMPs. We ask our colleagues in STOA, which is the Parliament's panel for the future of science and technology, to consider undertaking an assessment of the possibilities for de-risking investments in ATMPs, for example, via pay for performance and risk-sharing agreements between developers and payers. Moreover, for many ATMPs, administration will be in a small number of designated centers, meaning patients will need to travel for treatment. The importance of cross-border cooperation, including by optimizing the use of the Cross-Border Healthcare Directive, is therefore clear.
I endorse the Transform MEP Interest Group Charter, including the recommendation to improve infrastructure and enable cross-border patient access to transformative therapies. We need to develop mechanisms to facilitate access to cross-border healthcare. For example, by making national access points easily accessible for patients to get information and treatment options for cross-border care. We also need to remove the burden of upfront payment for patients wherever possible. And finally, EU financing could also be used to support travel expenses and translation services where needed for patients and their families.
You can download the charter from Transform website in transformalliance.eu. We hope this is the start of the conversation on how we can continue to build a Europe where patients can access the therapies of tomorrow, regardless of where they live or their financial background. We welcome other interested MEPs on this charter and to join the Transform MEP Interest Group. Moreover, we call on colleagues in the European Parliament and other European institutions to take these recommendations on board in the forthcoming legislative reviews, building a healthcare system that is fit for the future for all patients in Europe. Thank you for your support.
So there we have it, ladies and gentlemen, those key recommendations from the Charter outlined by the MEPs. And we're going to go through those recommendations, some in our first panel and some in our second. But the crucial message, overarching message from that video, now is the time to act. And that is what we want to focus on. What do we need to do? We heard already about the challenges, some of the problems that need to be addressed, but we also heard how very important it is to address them in a timely manner so that more people like Luke can share in the benefits of these therapies. So our first panel is entitled Future-Proofing the EU's Regulatory Framework to Accommodate Innovative Therapies, Opportunities Within the Current Review of the Legislative Acquis. We heard the ideal opportunity, the moment when we can really make a difference. I'm delighted to welcome, and he's already sitting with me, Billy Kelleher, who's a member of the Transform MEP Interest Group. Lovely to have you with us, Billy. Please do join us. Stefan van der Spiegel, Team Leader, Substances of Human Origin in the Unit for Medical Products, Quality, Safety and Innovation in the European Commission's Directorate General for Health and Food Safety, better known to most of us in Brussels as DG Santé. And among other things, as you heard, Stefan is responsible for the proposed regulation on substances of human origin. Do come and join us, please, Stefan. Eleni Antoniou, Senior Policy Officer at the Thessalenia International Federation. Great to have you with us today, Eleni. Gilles Vassal, who is a paediatric oncologist at the Gustave Roussy, a leading cancer research hospital, and he's a board member of CEOP Europe, the European Society for Paediatric Oncology, and Leila Sayed, Vice President Global Regulatory Affairs, Rare Disease and Serious Chronic Disease at Novo Nordisk. Great to have you all with us here today. The format for these sessions, totally interactive. I have some questions for our panel, and then I will also open up to the floor. And as I said earlier, you don't need to tap anything into a smartphone or a tablet. You can just raise your hands and I will give you the floor. So I'd like to start, panel, if I might. And Billy, let me come to you first. In terms of the context for our discussions, and then we'll drill down into some of those recommendations. For you, we've heard a lot already, Billy, about the challenge we face and why this charter is needed. What do you see are absolutely the key things we need to address to take account of the specific characteristics of these therapies and to future-proof the regulation? And do you believe now is a genuine moment of opportunity?
Yes, it's a genuine moment because we are going through a review of the EU pharmaceutical strategy, for example. I think that will underpin our broad discussions in terms of legislation, regulations, directives, but equally the tone of where we want to take Europe in terms of access to new therapeutic medicines. There is no doubt that the difficulty for Europe, and that was highlighted during the COVID pandemic, is that health is a national competency. And until such time as member states are brave enough to allow the transfer of more competence to the European Union, well, then we're going to always have those significant challenges around the disparate makeup of health across Europe. And that, in many areas, for example, in clinical trials, in assessment of medicines, in the payment of medicines, right across the entirety, there's different rules and different emphasis on what should be made available to patients in terms of healthcare. Now, we can have a lot of research, we can have a lot of technological advancements, innovation, but until such time as we actually have a system in place that can assess the efficacy of a medicine through the health assessment technology, and then to make it available to patients, and that there's a timely reimbursement, we're always going to have that difficulty about incentivising and rewarding innovation and creativity in medicines, and particularly in these type of medicines that we're talking about. And I think that from now on, we do have to accept that, we have the European Medicines Agency, that does the approval, but yet we've member states that can also act unilaterally on approval as well. But I firmly believe we just need to be more centralised in terms of clinical trials, sharing of information that was referred to, data, for example. Ireland is a population of 5 million, so in areas of cell therapy, gene therapy, and other orphan medicines, for example, we may not have the population base to do a clinical trial itself. So you have to be able to share all of those things across the entirety of the European Union, bearing in mind there's different genetic makeups of people, different illnesses and diseases in various ethnicities across Europe. So all of these things have to be done, and that requires sharing of information. And then finally, without taking up too much time, I certainly think that we have to have a system in place whereby there is an assessment made that a medicine or a therapy does a benefit, and that then there is a proper procedure in place where approval for reimbursement is made. And the reason is, and it has happened in Ireland and it happens in many member states, the medicine is not awarded to the patient based on the efficacy and its ability to help the patient. It's based on whether or not the member state government finances are healthy or otherwise. And we do need to get away from that, where budget surpluses, medicines are made available, and when they're not, there's a slower assessment and reimbursement.
And that, Billy, an issue I want to come back to because, of course, ATMPs are the first in line for joint clinical assessments from 2025. What difference will that make? How will we make it work? We will come back on that, I hope, in our discussion. But, Stefan, let me come to you. And in terms of the challenges, would you agree with what you've heard? Is there anything you would add? And as we've said, this isn't just about the legislative framework, but the legislative framework is front and centre right now. Does this provide, do you see, a real opportunity, both in the area you're working in, but also more broadly?
Thank you, Jackie. Yeah, and indeed, I think we are very much in line with a lot what is being said here. So, first of all, I already would like to thank Transform and also the MEPs beyond Transform in particular to bring us all together in one room, because I think that's what is since a long time needed, that we have all actors in the room to discuss this. In the end, what we want, how to get access to safe and effective therapies for the patients across Europe. Maybe at the beginning I also should half excuse myself, because I'm stepping in for my colleague who's dealing really with the pharmaceutical side from this. As you know, I'm more dealing with the origin, the substance of human origin side of this. But maybe that's not bad, because as you know, the pharma revision is currently work in progress, and there's at this point as Commissioner, it's not appropriate to go into much depth on that. But of course, the SOHO proposes on the table, so there I can say some more words also. So I would have 3 points to underline. I think the first one would indeed be from the SOHO perspective, obviously. Keep in mind this starts all with substances of human origin, and that means we have donors to work with. That means we need to make sure some concerns like communicable disease transmission always will have to be kept in mind. We sometimes forget that a bit in our enthusiasm for the new technologies. This also means that the donors themselves will have to be well protected and reassured that they can safely contribute to those developments. A second point I would like to underline is really to further encourage, and I think it starts with initiatives like this, the coordination and cooperation between different legal frameworks, substance of human origin and pharmaceuticals in this case. I think it's very good to see that this is already happening very much in the field. I see a lot of initiatives where industry is working together with academic hospitals to make those therapies available. And let's keep in mind it's the academic hospitals that collect the substances. Often it's prepared by industry, but we also see important developments in academics to prepare the therapy. It's also the academics that do the applications to the patient and that can organize the follow-up of the outcome in the clinic. I think we'll talk later also with the registries from the cornea registries. Last time the registries came up on the bone marrow transplant. I think there's really a lot of value in bringing all those sites together, and I think that's also a challenge, but I'm very hopeful for that, but something that we really need to organize at the regulatory level. The authorities need to talk more together, and I think there's a lot of ideas also there in the SOHO regulation we'd like to propose there. And the last point maybe is indeed, I think, in particular, looking a bit on the academic side, what's happening there. I think we are, as Commission, aware of some concerns that we need to make also clear the transparency. We need to make sure, as was said before, that there's also some common approaches in there. These are important therapies. We need to make sure we capture the learnings of them, and all the patients can benefit from that. And of course, with that, also the link between GMOs and clinical trials. I think that's well on our radar. But as said, on those last points, I can at the moment not go much into depth.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and thank you for stepping in. I should also have mentioned, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Ana Hidalgo Simon from the European Medicines Agencies had very much wanted to be with us and unfortunately had to cancel at the last moment and sent her apologies, but really grateful to have you with us. Let's continue to build our picture of the challenges and then we'll dive into some of those recommendations in more detail. Eleni Antonio, if you could please just, from what you've heard, is there anything you would particularly highlight? Is there anything missing from the picture we're building here?
So I would first like to thank you for being here for the patients, because we're all here to find solutions for the end users of ATMPs. This is very important because, as Luke said in the very beginning, we start with the daily struggle of patients who live a life of expectations and hopes and long for a cure. So we are here to safeguard their right to health, and this is very important, and we need to have that in mind. So thalassemia has actually been linked to recent failure, and the gene therapy was actually there for thalassemia in Europe, but we experienced a systemic failure, and we need to find a solution to avoid that from happening again, because we have more than 800 gene and cell therapies in the pipeline. So we need to be prepared. So the fragmented landscape is not helping in Europe. There is fragmentation and there is a huge gap, and I need to highlight that, and that is the gap of the registries. There is an absence of registries. And we had that experience from COVID because we were not able as member states to identify those vulnerable groups, and we're not in position as member states to actually do some very good health planning and saving of resources. So we cannot refer to good resources management and finding resources for ATMPs without knowing how many patients are there, how many patients are eligible. So this is something I would like to highlight. And of course, there is a number of things to highlight as well. I will just make a reference and then we can delve into them. So transparency, as Stefan said, this is something we need to consider because we saw the Minister of Malta having an initiative recently on transparency specifically. We have a huge chapter, that of education and awareness of all stakeholders, including the national authorities, because they are not aware, of course, of 800 gene and cell-based therapies that are in the pipeline. So HTA not present in all countries, we need to have that in mind, and we need to have that in mind that pricing and reimbursement procedures are not the same in Europe. So this is an extra obstacle for the companies and something that inhibits fast access to patients, to those therapies for the patients. And of course, something I would like to highlight and stress enough is that we don't have patient participation at all levels. We need to have patients there, from the very design to the production to the post-marketing follow-up. Patients need to be there, and we need to see that in all the revised legislation that is coming up.
Thank you very much. Very clear recommendations, very clear priorities there. We will come back on some of these issues in our discussion. Let me turn to Gilles Vassal, paediatric oncologist, as I said earlier. Gilles, wonderful to have you here. From your perspective, what would you focus on particularly in terms of that challenge and the opportunity we have now to meet those challenges?
First of all, I would like to say that SIOP Europe fully endorsed the 7 recommendations and thanks very much members of the Parliament who are engaged and committed to make this regulatory environment really facilitating development and access to these ATMPs. In childhood cancer, these medicines are very important and are open avenues to really cure more children and cure them better. I just would like to take one example. There are 2 gene therapies that have been centrally approved, and then the company withdrew the drug from the market, which I think is a very important message. And the message that we do have is that we cannot see limitation of the development of this medicine access to commercialized product. And this is why we believe that having academic teams fully qualified to develop and provide access to these therapies for patients very important. I just take the example of childhood cancer. CAR T cells have been really at the forefront of approved medicine in this setting in leukemias. The development then by companies are not much on pediatric cancers. But there are pediatric academic teams really developing CAR T-cell for these solid tumors, with some preliminary results in brain tumors and some very exciting results very soon to pop up in neuroblastoma. This is academic. So clearly we need to see as well the capacity to set up in Europe the capability to generate, to provide this treatment to the patient, not through commercialized product. And it's something we do. For the last 20 years, we have been doing cell therapy for childhood cancer, allogenic and autologous. So we do have teams already skilled and able to do so. So we believe that this is extremely important, and this change in the ecosystem regulation should really facilitate the development and the provision, including GMP production by academic, to assure more largely access to all patients. And the other thing I would like to say, which is very important, is early dialogues. Early dialogues, this is absolutely key. We have in Europe regulation, we have the pediatric regulation, we have the EMA, and now we have the HTA regulation, which is good. But how can we see this together very early, anticipated what is needed for the development of medicine to serve both the evaluation by EMA, but also the evaluation by the HTA, as soon as they will be jointly looking together how to evaluate this compound. So early dialogues is absolutely key. And the last message is multi-stakeholder. This is clearly what was done through this process, absolutely great, and the fact that the implementation will be through a multi-stakeholder process is absolutely key. Sorry, Jackie, I was too long.
Not at all. Please don't. No. Thank you very much indeed. And that point about early dialogue, particularly as you say when it comes, and we were just touched on it earlier, to the joint assessments, will be absolutely crucial, something very central in the recommendations. Leila Syed from Novo Nordisk, complete the picture from an industry perspective. What for you are the most important of the myriad challenges we've discussed? And say we'll come to the recommendations later, and do you see this as a real moment of opportunity?
Thank you very much, Jackie. It's a pleasure to be here.
Can you turn yours off, Sheila? No, you.
No, I was opening for her.
It's easier than the camera follows.
I need to.
The right person.
Thank you very much. Very kind of you. No, but it's a pleasure to be here, and I think it's a no-brainer if you look at how fantastically Transform has put together this charter, and if you look at how many boxes and how many legislations and how many directives and how many, I can go on and on, it taps into. This is really an area we have to handhold. We have to handhold it through the entire value chain, from the early involvement, from the candidate selections, be it coming from academia, be it coming from developers, industry, patients, and of course remembering patient in the center. The regulatory frameworks have been there for some time. I mean, if you look at the ATMPs, the cell and gene therapy, it's not something new, but are they fit for purpose? And I think we have a unique opportunity with the general pharmaceutical legislations and the OMPs and the pediatrics and so on to really revisit that from the lens of ATMPs. These are by far unique all the way. So we have a great opportunity, but what industry, my peers and we feel is that there are a lot of good intentions. Nobody's doubting the intentions from any of the stakeholders here, but we need to see the momentum now. We need to see some concrete actions and not making more bodies and more research incentives. And so we have to see, that's the number one thing. So the regulatory frameworks are not fit for purpose for the ATMPs. Secondly, I think we have to bring modernization and inject ambition back into EU. And it's not just from the regulatory perspective, but also how we bring the investments back. How we enable the European Union to stay ahead of the curve. When we look at the other regulators, I mean, they're trying to be the market leaders, the US, the Japanese, the Chinese even. And what it does is that, of course, as an industry, as a developer, one of the important factors for us when we embark on investments is a robust regulatory framework, a predictable, strong, and agile regulatory bodies. The ecosystem that's the first thing. The second thing is about, conducting clinical trials.
Can we come back to that in just a moment?
Sure. Yeah. So that was the second point. And third, last but not the least, I think it has been mentioned from all of you, real-world evidence is not new either. It's been there on the block for many years. But what it means and what actions would we like to walk away for the ATMPs, that's the real case.
And that we will come back to, because that's one of the clinical trials issue, the real-world evidence, both issues we want to delve into. So, as you heard, and thank you very much, the Charter contains recommendations in 7 areas. I want to focus on the 4 that I think are most relevant for this session. And I want to start with, if you see when you look at the Charter, there is a sort of pie chart, if you like, with something right at the centre and then the other ones round it. And at the centre, and I mentioned it earlier, and it was mentioned by Billy in the video, creating that dynamic, patient-centric innovation ecosystem to address areas of medical need. And I just want to ask, we've talked, and a lot of people, a lot of MEPs talked in the video about the incentives. We also heard about the challenge. I stopped you for a moment there, Leila, and I'll come back to you first on this, if I might. Reducing clinical trials in Europe compared with the US. Why is that? And when you said how do we bring it back, you mentioned the legislative framework. What is needed to really incentivize developers to invest in this, to do the clinical trials in Europe, from your perspective?
Yeah. Thank you, Jackie. So some statistics, just for our fellow colleagues here, it's around 11% of the ATMP trials have only sites in the European Union, global trials, compared to 46% of the clinical trial sites in Asia Pacific. So it's not just the US, just to bring in another angle that is global, right? And when we do the horizon scanning, it's a handful of ATMPs. We're expecting approval, or hopefully approval, regulatory decisions from EMA next year, whereas more than 10 from FDA. These are the known facts. So back to your point, what will it take? I'll give you a very concrete example. We have spoken about the GMO rule, right? So this will be a great help to remove it from that step. And because the ERA, the environmental risk analysis assessment at the end, is going to be there, it is adding approximately 6 months. So when you're doing first human dose trials in ATMPs, in cell, gene, these ATMPs, we're not going to open many centers. It's one country, one center, very niche based on the knowledge, the expertise in that country. And if that regulatory agency is even interpreting the GCP laws, the GCP rules in the national way and bringing the GMO and really putting it at the level it should not be, that is not even letting the trials lift up. Another thing is the CTR. I personally believe it's going to be very good. I think the peers industry, we're looking forward to that. But let's not fool ourselves. The clinical trial regulation has some barriers, which is going to hamper ATMP. So I'll come back to that one as well during the panel if you think. I can also give some examples here if you want.
Very briefly, if you would, because I want to deal with this one and then we'll move on.
GMO is the one part, and I think it has been discussed earlier. We need to remove that. If not remove, have another look into it to modify and relieve some of that burden, the regulatory burden which is there. So the clinical trial regulation is, again, first human trials. In these ATMPs, there will be no phase 2. You are testing in your patients in small set of niche patient populations, and you will be replicating, hopefully, in a bigger phase 3 trial, right? So with the clinical trial regulation, the whole idea about, again, it's like a decentralized procedure, right? You'll have a rapporteur, a co-rapporteur, you can select the representative member states or not. I'm not sure that is going to foster innovation in ATMPs. And I'm saying that there are mixed opinions about it. But CTR has to be looked into from ATMP lens as well. It is a very good framework. It is there to improve a lot of things. I'm pretty hopeful, but it's not going to, per default, solve ATMP issues.
Thank you.
Because it goes down to national.
Yeah, which goes back to the problem we were talking about earlier, Billy raised it at the beginning. Gilles, from your perspective, what reason do you think, what's the main reason why we have this issue of reduced clinical trials compared with the rest of the world? And more broadly, that incentivisation of the development, what for you is key here?
All the administrative burden in setting up any clinical trial, as mentioned, is important. I would be very, very curious for you to give some example of what are the specific issues for ATMP in the new clinical trial regulation. Because for me, we are moving, at least after a few years, many years, from a directive completely implemented differently in each member state to one regulation implemented centrally, and including 2 levels of high risk and low risk trials. So for me, it's a real progress. So I would be very curious to know and to understand what is for you the hurdle or the risk in the implementation of the CTR for the ATMPs, which is not obvious to me. But for me, we need more incentives, correct incentive, early incentive, to really be sure that when the disease is rare, when there is really a proof of concept, the incentives can really make small companies and academia develop the clinical trials. I think the clinical trial is just after the decision to move forward.
Yeah. I'm not sure we'll have time to go into the detail of this, but maybe it's a coffee break discussion as well, because we've got so many issues to get through. But Stefan, briefly, if you would, in terms of this question of adequate incentives, in a broader way, we'll come to more specific things later on, but what for you is the key? Why do you think we are lagging behind here?
Yeah. Thanks. Maybe first, I just want to put a small caveat on the side. We have noticed that clinical trials at this moment, or in the last 2 years, have gone down everywhere. Because of COVID, of course, academia had other roles to play than first. But that being said, of course, what was just said here is very true. There's very little, comparatively little EU activity compared to others. I would come back a bit, also because you brought in the word ecosystem in your... I would come back really to this need to foster collaborations and coordination between the academia on the one hand and the industries on the other hand, and not only at actors level, who's undertaking it, but also at the level of the authorities, And indeed, I fully can recognize the concerns mentioned here. If, for example, clinical trials are already a challenge for industries who have relatively significant resources available, at least compared to academia, they definitely will be a big challenge to look into for academia. But okay, that's as far as I can go, and now rather on the constatation side.
Absolutely, absolutely. Billy, you talked a lot about that sharing of information and so on. So this ecosystem approach that we're talking about, but ideally also cross borders, as you said. How do you see the challenge here? I mean, what is Europe doing wrong in this area in terms of the incentivization, do you think?
Well, I just think culturally Europe is not as progressive in terms of taking risk as we say the United States of America is, for example. I mean, their taxation systems in terms of losses being written off against profits, etc. All of these things are very important factors when people are making commercial decisions. Clinical trials are very expensive. There needs to be supports in place, there needs to be incentives, but there also needs to be a pathway to know that in the event of a medicine being approved, that there's a seamless pathway to it being reimbursed. I just think that is a critically important part. But I think overall, like, we have 27 member states, we have universities, adult teaching hospitals, industry, and sometimes they are not always working collaboratively or collectively. And that is a problem. So you take a smaller member state like Ireland or Malta or Greece or others that may not have just enough capacity. There has to be, transnational cooperation at a level. And that has to be done, I think, through some form of centralised system. Of course, the risk always is when you centralise something, you can sometimes inhibit innovation in a way because the regulations sit so heavily on top. So just like as reference was GMO, for example, and the clinical trial regulation itself may be restrictive in areas. But overall, I think future-proofing all regulation. The difficulty, and I'll say this finally, the difficulty with Parliament is it's a democratic assembly. It passes all the legislation in the European Union. The make-up changes from election to election. So I think there has to be always built-in review mechanisms in areas where technology is just moving so rapidly ahead. By the time we pass legislation in the Parliament, the technologies have already moved on. So we always have to have an inbuilt system to allow that assessment to continually evolve. Otherwise, we'll have a regulation now and we'll wake up in 5 years' time and it will be completely out of date.
Thank you very much indeed. Eleni, this ecosystem, the key ingredients, briefly if you would, and then we're going to have to go on a bit more of a whistle-stop tour through some of the other recommendations.
Even though most have been covered, because I'm the last, I would like to just build on the thought of Billy, because it's all about not having a review mechanism. We have bureaucracy, we have delayed processes, so for companies, for researchers, more time means more money, and they're not willing to spend more money on research in Europe because it is time consuming. But if we had an oversight mechanism in place, just monitoring the implementation of regulations, because we do have the documents, we do have the frameworks, they have been around for many years now. If there was a mechanism, and there is no such mechanism, monitoring at the national level what is happening with the regulations, because it's not enough to have the reports of the Commission, the health reports each year with data coming from the ministries. We need to have on-site inspection, what is happening, collection of data and feedback to know that these are the needs and these are the exact solutions that need to be implemented.
Thank you very much indeed. Let us move to the Charter recommendation talking about the importance, and we heard it in the video, of a clear definition, definition and regulation when it comes to appropriate regulatory requirements for safe and timely ATMP development and the key issues that we need to address. Let me come to your area of responsibility first, Stefan, if I might. As we heard, and I think it was Sirpa who talked about it in the thing, about this concern about making very clear distinction between ATMPs and blood, tissue and cells applications. There is a worry out there. Can you just respond on that?
Yeah. No, thank you very much. I think we very much realized there is a need for good legal clarity on what legal requirements are applicable in what situation. Actually, if you go to our impact assessment that we prepared with the SOHO proposal, you will see there's actually almost 1 in 2 of the consulted people really have questions on legal clarity. That being said, the criteria that set the borderline are not set in the SOHO regulation. They are set in the pharma framework. The SOHO regulation applies on all substances of human origin, from collection until final application, unless the steps in the middle, or some of the steps in the middle, fall under another legal framework, like the pharma framework. Then it becomes subject to the pharma legislation. So it's a kind of, from SOHO side, a passive borderline that is set in the regulation, which is, by the way, the current approach. We changed nothing on that. In the current tissue cells directive, the same. It is, of course, also future-proof, because, as we know, pharma framework is in movement. So if there would be changes there, then that would not need us to go back to the SOHO regulation. That being said, and regardless, in the end, I think however you draw criteria, and we have criteria now in the pharma setting, but however you draw them, there will always be common questions. You can draw them perfectly today. In half a year of now, we have new therapies that put questions on this. So what the SOHO proposals rather trying to do is to make sure that those questions can be addressed and that there can be clarity across legal frameworks. And that's the real value that the SOHO Coordination Board will bring. It will, to start with, answers questions already within the SOHO framework, and where there's a real need, something is not clear in that gray area in the middle, there will be, and as we've seen, there will be reach out and coordination with the bodies in the other frameworks, and like the CAT. So I think that's the approach we propose.
Thank you. Before we move on to the other core issue here, does anyone want to briefly react on that one? Eleni?
I need to react because our patient community is transfusion dependent. So the SOHO regulation is actually very important for us. And we welcome the initiative of the Commission to actually revise a 20-year-old framework and try to update and upgrade the different features and to make the whole framework future-proof. Mm-hmm. And we do believe that our views were actually heard. And we see that there is legislative agility in the SOHO regulation, and that agility and that interplay is not present in the pharma legislation. And this is something we need to pay attention to while revisiting the different legislative files.
Thank you very much indeed. Brief one, if you would, Leila, and then we'll move on to the hospital exemption.
Yeah, so I totally agree with you both. Hospital exemption has a special place in special circumstances. So what's more important, again, bringing the patient in the center, is these are, again, reiterating, very, very complex. Even a slight change at the molecular level, at the cellular format level, that the whole from starting material to the end therapeutic product could have potentially harmful effects for the patients. So the trust we have we have to earn the patient's trust, right? So the trust we have as nothing like one stakeholder or other, as an ecosystem, is very precious. So let's strive to have very clear sets of guidelines and clear sets of expectations and be transparent about them. Because the ATMPs being governed by centralized procedure by no means standards should be higher compared to the hospital exemption. So the minimum list of standards and the quality requirements, they need to speak to each other.
Thank you. And indeed, that is the Charter calls about EU standards for the use of the exemption and European registries to record their use. Gilles touched on this in his opening. It was the key challenge that you highlighted here. I'll give you a chance to react in a minute, Gilles, but does anybody want to come in on this question of the hospital exemption? Gilles, did you want to come back? Yeah.
Oh, I think I made the point.
You did, very clearly.
We cannot limit the development and availability of ATMP to commercialized product.
Yes, please, Eleni.
And raising the capacity of the high quality, I fully agree with you, accreditation, equality, and so on, from the academic side, is the way to broaden accessibility for many of these patients to this therapy. I don't say all, but many of these.
I should just mention, if we'd had the European Medicines Agency with us today, we would have heard a bit more about, Tomasz referred to it in his opening, the pilot project that has been launched to support the translation of basic research developments and assess what support, what regulatory tools might be provided in this area. But Eleni, you wanted to come in.
I couldn't agree more with Gilles, of course, but we must not forget quality. Absolutely. And quality comes with standards. Absolutely. And if we have EU standards for harmonization, then we are on the safe side.
Absolutely. Okay. Fully agree. And then sufficient investment for this as well. We need EU to invest in this academic part of ATMPs.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry this is such a whistle-stop tour, but now we need to move on to another area the Charter calls for action, that of real-world evidence to address uncertainties. And I just, talking about investment, picking up on that word that Gilles used, do we have enough investment now? And perhaps I come to you first on this, Eleni, because this is very much also about healthcare professionals and patients being at the centre of this. Do you think there is enough investment now in gathering the robust evidence that we need if we're really going to have patient-centric assessments? And more generally, how do we really embed the patient? One of the points the Charter makes, the patient right through the process in collecting, helping to collect this evidence and be able to use it in the most effective way.
Thank you, Jackie, because I think it's the first time I won't say much. So it's a no. So there is not enough investment because there is no infrastructure yet for the collection of real-world data and then evidence, because data are then analyzed and become evidence. So in the absence of real-world evidence, we saw and we have experienced as thalassemia community the rejection of gene therapy in Europe because there was not enough data. There was not enough real-world evidence. So if there is no such thing as a registry for the collection of data, and if there are no evidence generation requirements, a specific set of requirements for the collection of data, then there is nothing. And we need to work on that, and we need to invest on the generation of data.
Thank you very much. Leila.
Yes. Thank you, Jackie. Again, I apologize if I'm comparing too much with the competitors here, but I need to bring back FDA here again. And I'll totally agree with you, Eleni. I'll come with a very concrete example of what you're bringing. Patient-focused drug development, real-world evidence, patient voice, these are not new concepts. And if I sounded a bit frustrated in the beginning, in the opening, it's because now it's time for actions. So if you look at FDA, they have released a series of guidances. And they're draft, but they operate with the draft guidances, right? So it's so detailed, from the holistic, from the strategic, from the technical, the patient involvement per step, towards the end at the templates, how are you going to record that data in your submissions? So real-world evidence is one thing, and for ATMPs, for sure, there's a lot of value in post-marketing because we won't have that golden standard randomized controlled trials for the HTAs. It's not ethical. We will not have randomized controlled trial. So, of course, for the very long-term follow-up, we do need registries. Totally agree. Therapy areas like hemophilia and some of the others, these are fortunate. I don't know if I should call it fortunate, but they've had enough attention. If we just knew how much data we already have, if we just knew that, the role of the regulators and the frameworks, what they can do is bring a very concrete and transparent guidance so that we even start looking into what we already have. The data from that point becoming to the regulatory grade, that is what we need. The regulatory decision-making based on that data, be it the regulatory approvals, be it the HTA part of the most important part of the journey and bringing those innovative therapies to the patients. Real-world evidence is not new.
Stefan, did you want to come in on this?
I agree with what was said, just that the real-world evidence is not new, but I'm more optimistic actually than Eleni, because I think, and here again I would repeat my call for coordination between the industry and the academia. If we look at the academic side, there are a lot of initiatives on real-world data already that will be very useful for making sure those therapies are available and kept safe, and probably also prove to payers that they're worth their money. I think we'll hear after in the second round from a cornea transplant registry that can be useful. But I think the big example to look at is the registry from the European Bone Marrow Transplant Society. They every year they collect data for around 40,000 bone marrow transplants, and the registry has been certified by EMA as a point of reference to also assess the safety, quality, efficacy for CAR-T therapies. So I think there are elements there that really can be used and should be. Of course, that being said, it should not be the only part. I think clinical trials, GMP, are essential. And actually, I also understand from some contacts from academia that is also not a problem, that academia can do good clinical trials, can do work with GMP.
The talk here is very much of it as a compliment, and in areas where you can't get all the answers through those trials. Going to have to move on in a sec, Eleni. 10 seconds.
A very final comment, because as you've said, Stefan, there are elements, there are initiatives coming from NGOs. The World Federation of Haemophilia has set up a registry on the post-monitoring of gene therapies, and there is no such thing at the regulatory and the EU level. So we need an EU mechanism, not just specific isolated initiatives.
Okay. Yes, please do.
I think there are too many microphones on.
Yeah, I think there are now. Let me just turn there we go.
Yeah, thank you. This one is working. Thank you very much. Real-world evidence. I would use the word data outside clinical trials. And I think there are two major needs. The first one is for the evaluation, the comparators. Especially when we cannot run a randomized trial, we need, especially for the HTA, good data to have the comparator. And then the follow-up of the patient receiving the therapies, and not on the short term, but also on the long term, because the long-term issues of these patients receiving these innovative therapies, especially kids, when they become, we don't know what it is. And I would like just to highlight one point. One of the big issues is the uncertainty to really, for HTA and payers, to decide yes or no. And for me, the uncertainty comes when there is a decision. It's very, very rare that the decision is cancelled later on because the data showed it doesn't fit, it doesn't relate. So if we have good data, post-marketing authorization, really to provide information of is the decision that was rightly taken at this time because there was a real need of the patient. But when we follow the patient over time, well, the results are not so good. Then there can be action in terms of withdrawing regulation, withdrawing authorization. That might be a very effective way to take more risk for HTA and payers to decide, yes, we should reimburse.
Because they can backtrack later if it was wrong.
Exactly.
Yeah, thank you.
And I think this is something very new, because if you look at the moment, how many such things happened, even when there are post-marketing things and so on, it's very, very rare.
I'm glad you raised the question of HTA. I'm sorry this is such a whistle-stop tour. I do want to give you a chance if you have any brief questions or comments, but I want to just touch on one more recommendation before I do that. The realisation of an EU HTA system that supports timely patient access to ATMPs, and this, Billy, was where you started. This was front and centre of your remarks when we talked about the challenge. And as we've mentioned, ATMPs first in line for these joint assessments. What is going to be key to really make this work? Billy, first.
The political will of member states is the truth of the matter. I mean, this will be, again, decisions at member state level in terms of budgets being made available, health technology assessments, it will pass the authorisation, and then the question is whether or not it will be approved and given to patients. And this goes back to just the previous debate, clinical trials and real-world data. Like, the more clinical trials we have, the more follow-up real-world data we have over a prolonged period of time, leads then to giving confidence in terms of health technology assessments and the follow-up that governments will make, whether or not there is actually a real gain in this. It will give confidence both in terms of expanding clinical trials, then moving to collating the real-world data, and that in itself, I think, will give a body of information, both for research, academic side of it, the industry itself, but for governments to have confidence when they're making decisions on budgets. And I just say this, Jackie, I stood outside Parliament in Ireland protesting with patients to try and get a medicine approved. And the reason I was there was because inside we were making decisions to keep the lights on in hospitals. So the decision was, do we fund a patient group with a life-saving therapy, or do we keep the lights on in the hospitals? And while we're making those decisions, we will always go for the lights on in the hospital from a political perspective. So we have to find new ways of funding these innovative medicines. We have to have a hypothecated fund, a fund separate from the everyday funds that are required from a budgetary perspective in member states across Europe. Otherwise, you'll always have that difficulty making the choice between current expenditure, short-term political outlooks, we trading in the political business, and the longer-term supporting innovative creative therapies.
Thank you, Billy, and that's something we will come back to, I hope, in our next session about learning from each other about how to use these innovative new ways of funding. Any questions or comments from all of you? They're going to have to be brief. I'm afraid we don't have long. Could you please introduce yourself, sir? Yes.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Esteve Trias. I'm the qualified person for a hospital clinic in Barcelona, and I took the floor just because of the pilots of Ana Hidalgo not being there. Just I try to explain our experience, as a pilot in the European Medicine Agency, as the first academic unit that received the prime to be fighting for the central authorization as a CAR-T that we developed there. So I think that the EMA is trying to adjust, how to answer to our I think that our commitment to keep the therapy on the academical basis to a very short price, just to guarantee the access to the patients and to be sustainable in the Spanish health system, that otherwise will not be that point. The therapy has been developed by donations and public health funding. And we have the good experiences to be there. But just listening to the panel, we have in our pipeline, first of all, just go to this therapy. We are working under hospital exemption, but when I heard about the discussion of hospital exemption in Spain has three things that I think that are crucial. Maybe it's not the same everywhere. That the first thing is that quality and safety is the same that for pharma companies. It's GMP regulation and authorized and inspected by the Spanish Medicine Agency. The second one is that the development of the therapy should be performed under clinical trials. So we perform the clinical trials that we demonstrate the efficacy in the same way. And the other thing is that quality and safety is warranty for the patients, because sometimes when I hear that quality and safety and risk approach of the changes and that for the patients, it looks like the academy are not focused on that. And of course, we are medical doctors and we are focused in the risk of our patients, and the patients is the center of development. And I think that the hospital exemption in that field works quite well, and the access of the patients as well as the data collection and that has been mentioned is the focus. But just to
very briefly, if you would. Sorry, we are running out of time.
Yeah, and the other point is just to say that when we talk about affording new clinical trials, in our pipeline we have more than other 32 CAR-Ts, 5 of them on clinical trials, and the main challenge is how to afford the new developments, the new clinical trials and that, because our developments are focused in public funding, just to develop our trials and that. That was the only thing.
No, thank you.
So
it's
much.
Great to hear from you. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for sharing that with us. Resource, absolutely central. Maybe it's something we didn't touch on in the panel. Any other points, please?
Again, Thomas Boran, Czechia State Institute for Drug Control. Just a quick comment. I agree that, as it was mentioned, we don't have standards for hospital exemption. We have GMP for ATMPs, so just one comment. And second, I would like to argue that clinical trials regulation is not helpful. I think after removing those technical bugs, it will be helpful, as you will have one-stop shop, you will have a single ethical committee consideration, and you have predictable timelines. The problem is that GMO approval is not harmonized, and for clinical trials regulation, the member states already started 8 years ago with the voluntary harmonization procedure, so I think it is valuable for ATMPs.
Thank you very much. Stefan, I think you wanted to come in.
Yeah, very small overall comment on the last point on HTA. Obviously, these are very difficult discussions we see in the member states about the budgets. We hope the EU initiatives can support that. But overall, maybe an underlying point of hope, if I can bring that, is that, of course, HTA discussions are always more tense if the prices and budgets we're talking about are higher. And I believe to understand that, and that's maybe good because that we have, the prices are typically higher for when the therapies first come on the market. We heard about 300,000 to 400,000 euros for the first CAR-T that were offered by companies, but I've now heard prices going down really a lot. I don't know if Dr. Trias can comment on that, but I heard 1/3 or 1/4 of that cost in your hospital, and I've even heard now prices would go to 30,000 or less, and I think that's probably solving a lot of the problems and improving the access for the patients. So we'll have to see what comes there.
Absolutely. I think we are, and this is another burning point from the audience, we are almost out of time. Never like to keep you from your coffee, particularly at this stage in the afternoon, or your flight. But Billy, before you go, do you need to run?
I need to run.
I'll come to you first then, because I wanted to come back to this point. The charter, the video, time to act. Leila said, great opportunity, a lot of good intentions. We need concrete actions. For you, Billy, and I realise this question is unfair because the charter says explicitly these recommendations must be viewed holistically as each is equally important. So I'm not going to ask you for a top priority, but I am going to ask you for a key next step. The most important thing you think we need to do now to take this charter and turn it into action, as the charter calls for and Leila underlined.
That the European Union would become the de facto organiser in terms of centralising without that overly regulatory burden side of it, but that there would be more centralised decision making around health. That then could lead into the areas, for example, budgets, whereby member states would be able to put a certain percentage of GDP or something into budgets for health technology assessment, approval and high-end medicines coming in the stream. Otherwise, we're going to have a patchwork, in my view, forever and a day. So in areas of budget, that the European Commission would take a central role in determining the budget and making it available. So health technology assessment, approval, and then member states. Otherwise, member states would be saying, well, we can't approve it now. We don't have the money. We don't have the capacity to fund it. So that would be one area that would give confidence then to industry, to academia, and to everybody else to invest in research and innovation. That would be one area. There's many others, obviously. But
Thank you so much, and bon voyage. Thank you.
Merci
We'll let you
beaucoup,
go.
Jackie.
We'll let
Merci
you go.
beaucoup.
Thank you so much, Billy. Thank you. Okay, let's just run down the line, and for each of you, your key next step. As I say, I'm not going to ask for a priority because they all matter. Key next step, Gilles.
To raise our capacity in academia to collect good and robust real-world data. Because we all agree we need this. It's obvious for pharmaceutical companies. It's obvious for regulators. It's not so clear in the academic community. Because the academic community, especially in our field, well, over the last 50 years, we've been using the drug in the pharmacy. So the issue of cost was not an issue. Now it's an issue. And the academic community is not well knowledgeable about these needs, and to really partner, and this is a partnering for the development but also for the follow-up after the approval, raising the capability and raising the understanding of the relevance and the importance of this in the academic community.
Thank you so much. Leila.
Thank you, Jackie. ATMPs is one of the areas where we need to converge more, not just within European Union, but outside as well. Because we have to go to the patients. Not all patients are going to come to European Union. So we need to take, of course, European Union, but also contribute to the bigger community, which is globe. And this is one area where it's so diverging from early research and development to HTAs and to approvals. We have examples. ICER has considered that evidence enough from the US side, why it was not considered enough from the HTAs in European Union. So more convergence, please, on the regulatory frameworks, on the way we work. There are already clusters with agencies. This should be a standalone cluster where handheld hypercare is needed across the chain.
Thank you very much. Stefan.
You know, I can only partially answer your question.
I understand.
So I'll do it from my side. I think the key next step is really to foster coordination and collaboration between, not only at the professional level, but also at the authorities level, between the pharma and the SOHO side authorities.
Thank you very much. Eleni, you have the last word.
I have the last word, indeed. So we have the tools, but we need to be smart in how to use them. So we need to have as a principle to remember patients, and we need to keep patients in all policies. And of course, it is important to monitor the implementation of all this regulation, of all these tools we have, and we are lucky to have. So, Jackie, for us, the patients, we call for collaboration, harmonization of processes, interoperability of all the different mechanisms that exist in Europe. And this is very important for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Will you join me in thanking our panel very much indeed for a great discussion? I wish we had twice as long, but we've covered an enormous amount of ground. Thank you very much to you all. Going to take a break now for that much needed coffee, and I will see you back here at 4:15, so just 29 minutes, when we'll talk about new approaches to fostering. That point about coordination, collaboration. How do we realise, build on what we've done, realise agreed level, EU level actions, and build on national learning? See you soon.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
The coffee is being served in the room. You do not need to leave the room. It's being served just here, so grab yourself a coffee.
Yeah, the video is a bit off, you see. So look, it's in between, you see.
going to start again in about 3 minutes, so if you could begin to take your seats gradually, very gradually. Can I ask my last two panellists to come and join me? Simone, how are we? Okay, let us get underway because we have another panel where we have a huge number of issues to cover. I also want to be able to come out to all of you again for your comments and questions. And we heard in our first session, we began with that eloquent testimony from Luke as to why this issue is so important, and all our opening speakers underlined the urgency, the need to act now to ensure that we can have more stories like Luke's and that patients really do get timely and safe access to these new therapies. We focus more in the first panel because of this unique, ideal opportunity that our panellists spoke about because of the review of the pharmaceutical legislation on the regulatory framework. How do we future-proof it? We're going to focus more now on some of the things that go beyond legislation, but obviously they continue to be part of the equation. And in this session, entitled New Approaches to Foster Safe and Timely Patient Access to ATMPs in Europe, Realising Agreed EU-Level Actions and Building on National Learnings. So what do we need to do to implement what we've already agreed to do? And what can we learn, for example, from regional collaborations in this area? What can we learn, and Billy was talking earlier about new and innovative payment methods, what can we learn from each other, and how do we share that best practice in the most effective way possible? With me to discuss this, delighted to welcome back Andrej Knotek, MEP, who, as I said earlier, is co-chair of the Transform MEP Interest Group. Thank you for double hatting today, Andrej. Simone Bosselli, Public Affairs Director at Eurordis Rare Disease Europe. Simone, always great to have you with us. We have Donato Bonifazi, who is a coordinator at the European Paediatric Translational Research Infrastructure, EPTRI, and I'm particularly delighted to welcome you, Donato, because he has stepped in at the last minute to replace Giovanni Migliaccio, who was unwell and couldn't be with us. We have with us Professor Moore Dickman, Assistant Professor at Maastricht University and EUI representative in the Healthcare Professionals Working Party of the European Medicines Agency. And we have Tai Salimullah, who is Vice President, Global Head, Value and Access, Novartis Gene Therapies. And Novartis, he's going to tell you a little bit about some of their experiences with gene therapies during our discussion. So as we did last time, I first would like to very briefly, panel, if we could, set the context, and then we can delve into some of the detail that is so, so important here. And I wanted to come back to something that Billy Kelleher talked about, because he was expressing frustration at the start of our first panel, that the limits and what the EU could do, because so much of this is a member state competence. But rather than necessarily say, well, what the EU can't do, I want to focus here on what the EU can do and the things that are possible. So I just wanted to ask you, and let me come back to you, Andre, whether you share Billy's frustration here or not. How do you see the role of the EU in helping to really unlock and drive this systems change that you've all been saying is so important?
Many thanks for the floor. Good afternoon again. On the plenary, I sit next to Billy, so we share a lot. And yes, of course, you are very right that there's a number of member states' competencies, and I have some understanding that member states simply want to keep a number of those competencies. But for example, from previous panel, we could hear that there is unfortunately a lot of fragmentation. And where I, let's say, see the same risk as Billy is that we need to still sit in the train. If we don't succeed to act, our patients will not get the treatments, and the whole afternoon is about this topic. And there is a second aspect, which is also, let's say, the global competitiveness one aspect, and it's about economy and about having talents in Europe and high tech and add value. So I think it is in general interests of EU level and member states level to simply find interface which can let's say polish the fragmentation in order to make the things moving. And of course the first what we can do is on EU level is to try to address the things and those priorities we have discussed into the legislation to come. And last point on this, it's logical that member states have to be motivated because they cannot reach the goals on one member state level. There will be never enough capacity, never enough resources, never enough knowledge. So this is a typical place where, or agenda which needs the EU solution, and I believe that we will succeed to turn it in reality. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you for being so positive. Yes, we can. You remind me of that English expression, where there's a will, there's a way. It's a question of the will to do it, is what I'm bringing out from what you said. Simone, how do you see the role of the EU here? What can it do rather than what it can't do?
Well, I think it's a massive role that the EU can play, whether it is through regulation or without policy incentives. We have a number of already well-established infrastructure, and here I think we haven't talked enough about the European Reference Network. But I wanted to share you a little story first and foremost. I think it was mostly to the day, 5 years ago, that my chief executive, Jan LeCam, was here in the European Parliament at the STOA event talking about the future of ATMPs with Guido Rasi and the then Commissioner Vytenis Andriukaitis. And at that time we talk about the 4 A's of ATMPs: assessment, availability, accessibility, and affordability. Now, when we look at the policy that are being brought to the table since 2017, on the phase of the assessment, we got possibly in 2024 a good European-wide joint scientific assessment for ATMPs. We still need to work on the details on how these methodologies will be implemented, but that's very important. But we still have to make a lot of progresses on the affordability part, on the accessibility part, meaning can those therapies be effectively accessible by patients, and their availability. So when it comes to the latest point, the availability, here we need to acknowledge that many of the therapies that are coming through, whilst there is potential for greater prevalent diseases, for the moment we will see only for rare diseases. And even ultra-rare diseases. When we look at the prevalence, and we know that 84% of the 6,000 and more rare diseases have a prevalence of less than 9 in a million, or maximum 500 patients in Europe, we know that the infrastructure needs to be running around center of excellences in different countries, because no country alone will have the same capability to do that. In this term, there is already a number of financial incentives or financial support that the European Union can give, be that through the EU for Health Programme for training, be it through structural funds for delivery of center of excellences, etc., etc. So the later part on affordability, for instance, I think it was already, and Mr. Keller should go back to his then Prime Minister Leo Varadkar, because he himself in 2018 in a speech in the European Parliament called for the European Union to come together. And obviously there is an incentive for a country like Ireland, or even, if I may, a country like the Czech Republic, to pull together the different purchasing power, for instance, to get into this, to get access to the patient in a timely fashion. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Simone. And we will come back on that issue of centres of excellence. One of the issues, one of the recommendations I want to look at later is this question of cross-border patient access and what we need to do in that area. But let's continue to build our picture. And if I could add another element, not just the EU's role in all of this, but going back to that question I asked our first panel, and that heart of the circle of actions that are recommended, that dynamic patient-centred innovation ecosystem. What are the key ingredients of it are? Donato.
What the key ingredients?
Of the ecosystem, this dynamic ecosystem that we need. But crucially first, that EU role.
Yeah. Can you listen? Yes, okay.
Yeah.
So, first of all, I would like to go back a little bit to regulation, because here we have still some issues with regulation, mainly two. And with the advanced therapies, clearly there is, first of all, the need to define what the regulators has to approve to work on, because it's not always clear what is an advanced therapy. So we need also to revise the regulation and to understand how to support all the new methodologies and approach where, for example, we have an application for a trial where you see that there are combined a device with the biological or with something else, with a cell therapy or with something else. So how to work on it. And also the basic maybe issue with the regulation is that it start ruling on what is already existing. So it has always difficulties in ruling innovation. It's not easy at all. And in this field, it's extremely not easy. So what could be the role of the Europe to make a good environment to promote, to boosting research? I think that nobody has, body, not person, but body, has really a leadership in this. No the member states, no the European Union, no the pharma industries, no the patients, nobody. So to really go towards and to increase this, we need to change the paradigm, as I already heard also in the previous panel. For example, the academic research is not included in this paradigm, so it's always suffering from translating innovation to industries. And there is no rule to do this. There is not a system. So we need to create a complete system when we are able to perform and to boost basic research, innovation in the academic environment, and then to translate it to make it accessible to the patient in the end.
Absolutely. And that, Donato, always an issue the EU debates in many, many sectors. It's probably what the EU feels it is least good at. Good at the research, not so good at the translation. Come back on that a little bit later. More from your perspective, what do you see as the EU's role here if we're to deliver that key objective of the Charter, that dynamic patient-centred innovation ecosystem?
Thank you. So I think it's important to start with the positive. I think we have some of the best scientists in the world working in Europe, and at least in the field of ophthalmology, we've seen some very exciting developments in recent years. So it's a very exciting period to be an ophthalmologist. We have the first cell-based therapy with marketing approval to treat corneal blindness, that's Holoclar, and we have the first gene therapy to treat an inherited retinal disease with marketing approval, that's Luxturna, that my colleague from Novartis will probably tell more about it. So these are exciting times for us as clinicians, but first and foremost for these patients who can experience life-changing therapies. The question is what we need to do in order to become better, and what can we learn from the challenges and the mistakes that we see from these two pathways. So first of all, you discussed the issues of availability and affordability. I think the issue, what is coming from all this discussion for me from the morning and also today, that it is a very fragmented landscape. There is a need for harmonization. There are many challenges, for example, health being a prerogative of the member states, so that makes it very difficult to harmonize it. But there are things that can be solved. For example, the hospital exemption that was discussed, that is a way, I think, to ensure that these medications are also available if, let's say, one of the companies decides to abandon them. And we have seen that. So what happens when a medication receives marketing authorization, patients can start benefiting from it, and then the company decides to abandon it. Then many times, even the academic centers that were involved in developing that treatment, if we are talking, for example, for the limbal stem cell therapy, it was developed in a certain academic setting. It was then transferred to industry. Let's say that the industry decides to abandon this therapy tomorrow. Even if we have already the knowledge in our history, it will take us 4 to 5 years to set up all the production and to start helping patients. So, and I think the pandemic has really made clear how important it is that we as Europe become self-sufficient. So even if, regardless of the companies deciding to abandon certain indications, we need to be self-sufficient. The second point is, and that is the issue of data. And that's also very complex because there are a lot of partners involved. There is the issue of what are the standard data sets, what are the outcome measures, how do we collect them considering the issues of interoperability. Stefan gave as example the ECCTR. It's a European registry for cornea and cell transplantation. How do you find funding for registries? So we were fortunate to receive funding from Europe, but how do you ensure the sustainability of these registries once the funding is over? And that there is a need to impose a data collection in a way that is independent from the industry, that collects long-term data, that captures the patient-reported outcome measures, sometimes even starting with developing reliable patient-reported outcome measure sets. They are not there for many of the conditions that we wish to treat, especially those who are so rare. So a lot of good things, but a lot of challenges, and we need to learn from this experience to become competitive. And I would like to finish with one thing, also returning to the pandemic. We have seen how regulatory authorities throughout the world can come together and approve a vaccine in a historically short time. So there should be room, I think. I think in the first session we were discussing the FDA as if it's our competitor. The US is our competitor. I don't see it like this. I think they are our partner. We need to make sure that that patients across the pond can receive access to the treatment. We need to work together and also harmonize our processes with the US to make sure there is one way to the patient.
Which was a point that Leila made in our first panel, that need for a global context and coming to the global, because that is your role, Ty. More saying there, we're in exciting times. These are good times. But our focus a lot in our first discussion was on some frustrations from our panel at the restraints, the difficulties for the EU to take that harmonised approach that people are calling for. How do you see the role of the EU and the challenge ahead?
So, thank you for the question. I think, look, we are really at a watershed moment for some of these 21st century medicines, I call them, in healthcare systems that were designed for chronic management and treat-up. So some of the symptoms that we heard in the previous panel and some of those frustrations, actually they're grounded in reality. It's because of the pivot moment we are at with this advance in science, this transformative effort that's going behind trying to find cures or potentially halt disease. So it's very real. Now, however, with lifting the mood music to say, where does the cautious optimism lie here, is, we've been able now as an organization, I'm very proud both in our autologous platforms and our AAV platforms, to have treated, certainly in our AAV platform, over 2,300 SMA babies worldwide, with 45 approvals and 35 access pathways, and majority of those pathways in Europe. And what some of the secret sauce has been around, I would call it commitment, collaboration, and cooperation around in real time, without a sort of formed playbook, really building this with member states, in this heterogeneous environment. Now, your question around what else can be done at the sort of EU level is, again, kudos to some of our colleagues in the regulatory space, in EMA, around the openness of when you have some of the early trial readouts and that ability to engage, to design the next phase of your development. We have found a very mature and openness in some of our learnings that we first had 5 years ago with our CART platform to now where we are with our AAV platform. And I'd like 3 things that I think that could emerge even more to strengthen that for the accessibility that was mentioned by my colleague. Number 1, at the HTA level, the speed to foster access for patients, to avoid duplication and end-to-end timelines, or at least an acknowledgement and a clinical appraisal, minimum standard. So you're not repeating that state by state, because, very small numbers of patients, addressing the root cause of disease, and you touched it really well. You may need to leverage data from the United States, Japan, Australia, to really address some of those rare diseases.
So that joint assessment that we're waiting for coming 2025 could be really crucial here.
So the joint clinical assessment is something that I think could be really timely when you're actually having your label discussions. So you're not then protractedly doing this back and forth and burning time, which really, frankly, bringing it back to the patients in the area of neurological muscular disease, where time is neurons. And why should our patients ever need to understand those timelines? For them, every single day counts, whether even you're in pediatric ALL. The second thing is, the quality is, I think there has to be a huge shift or pivot in, somebody touched on the earlier channel, the standards we're used to in thousands of patients in cardiovascular trials with phase 3 data, or even now with these oncolytic indications with overall survival. The reality is, the earlier panel touched on, you're going to have some level of data that's going to mature over time. And how do you get a appreciation and an acknowledgement of elements of value beyond just the trial data, which we touched on a lot around the real-world evidence. And number 3, bringing it back to the inclusiveness of making sure at each stage, passing the red face test to ensure is the patient's voice reflected in this. Number 2, outside of the patient voice are the medical societies that, who have grafted and learn about these diseases and who are trying to also benefit from this innovation. Is that being listened to and respected? And number 3, the industry sort of procedures that, we're global organizations, would love to work with one system and the next, but the reality is, you're having to make, I would say, trade-offs across the world. So being at the table, having those discussions early on is hugely beneficial for all parties.
Thank you very much. Let us begin to drill down into some of the detailed recommendations in the Charter. And I want to start with the issue of newborn screening. The Charter calls for sharing best practices. And when we talk about harmonisation, and you said earlier more, harmonisation, and everyone's saying difficult, that in a lot of these areas, the Charter is calling for guidelines. It's calling for sharing of learning, sharing of best practice, the EU to support and member states to support that. So this is one area where the Charter calls for the sharing of best practices and recommendations for guidelines on newborn screening, genetic testing and diagnostics. Can I just come back to you on this straight away? Because why is this so important? And what do we need to do to make this access to screening more equal across Europe?
Yeah, so this is critical area to the area of ATMPs, and certainly in neuromuscular diseases where we have a presence. And why is this critical is if you look at a human's lifespan and you're thinking about diagnostics and newborn screening at a very early age when you're trying to address the root cause of the disease. This is critical because that's where you're trying to get a magnitude of benefit and making sure that your intervention is going to have that effect in a very early situation. We've seen some dramatic effects across the world, not only in the United States, Japan, Germany, and most recently in the Netherlands, in a study that we published just recently around pre-screened patients and non-screened, and looking at the outcomes and the healthcare system savings and value. So over 10 years, it can cost anywhere between 2.4 million to 5 million of a child's life with spinal muscular atrophy. But you've screened that child early, lifting the burden out of the healthcare system and ensuring better outcomes. Now, some of the frustrations around this, and I think this is a really nice example for some neutral territory for the EU to play a fantastic brokerage role and actually level up the playing field, that when you have countries where you can go from anything screening from 2 to a country just screening for 48 diseases, that's a huge disparity. Now, we know everybody's on a learning curve here, but leveling up that playing field and bringing those best practices and harmonizing those and seeing where can we do that faster together, I think is a critical role that EU could play.
Thank you very much indeed. Comments, reactions to that? Simone first.
Sorry,
and then more.
No, I fully agree with the points on newborn screening. Eurordis has published 11 principles already a couple of years ago on how to try to, or still strive to harmonize those criteria for newborn screening, because we see also from the data that our colleague was talking about, that the earliest diagnosis possible not only can go for an approved treatment, but in the majority of cases for rare diseases can access an appropriate care pathway. And in this day and age, with the advent of the European Reference Network and the sharing of knowledge, there are much greater possibility for both the patient and the family to lead a better life, or to prepare for a life that will be with challenges. In the case of potential access to ATMPs, I'm afraid that not specifically in the case of SMA, but there is still reluctance between member states to share patient between countries when a treatment is effective and effectively cured.
I'll come back on that in a moment, but to this point about screening, I don't know.
About screening, yes. It was calculated that in Europe with 1.2 billion euros you can perform full genome screening of all the newborns. So it's an affordable cost. It's not acceptable that we don't do this because of the cost. We should consider what can do the European Union. Consider health and research as an investment, but not only because it is a moral obligation towards our next future generations, but because it will for sure save money in the future. So when you care, when you predict in advance, and when you care, you save money in the health systems, of course.
Thank you very much. More.
Yes, I think newborn screening is a fantastic opportunity in order to capture this information. And the question is what you do when you don't have it and you have already a treatment to treat patients, but you cannot reach them because many of these patients walk around without knowing what their diagnosis is. If the diagnosis is known, there is no awareness among the physicians that the treatment is available and that these patients could come into consideration for this. And if this treatment, the diagnosis is known, the physician knows this, and they want to seek for this treatment, then and the treatment is available in the next country, they cannot go there because their insurance company will not let them because it's very expensive. You mentioned the level field, but also we see that the price of these therapies varies from one European member state to another. So it's not a really leveled playing field also when it comes to that. So I think screening is very important. It's the start of this trajectory, but there is need for education both of patients and of physicians. When it comes to rare diseases, I think the ERN framework offers a wonderful opportunity to do that. But we need to consider how we deliver these therapies in terms of central funding so that patients can receive that regardless where they're living. So screening is the beginning, but we need to make sure that the rest is also available.
Thank you very much. I want to come now to another key recommendation of the Charter, and we talked about it a lot, the new access pathways to support the sustainability of healthcare systems, because something you underlined right from the beginning, Andre, is the importance of ensuring, whatever we do, ensuring that sustainability. And one of the things it talks about is the regional collaborations. We have seen, for example, in the Benelux, some examples of regional collaborations between groups of member states. So, leaving aside what the EU can't do, member states can collaborate more. I see you smiling here. Do you think, what can we learn from the collaborations that have been done so far? Some have been more successful, I think, than others. What lessons can we draw from it? More, and I know, Tay, you want to also talk about this.
Well, first of all, we can learn, collaboration is very difficult and it's based on trust. That's my personal lesson regarding collaborations in general. But what can we learn from it? So I'm part in the Netherlands area where I am working in Maastricht. So there is a program that's called RegMed XB, the Regenerative Medicine Crossing Borders, that's financed by both the Dutch and the Flemish government, where academic partners are sponsored in order to do research, but are also throughout this process are already escorted by regulatory advisors in order to make sure that no mistakes are done and that the regulatory pathway is being followed. I think Esteve, who has left, I see, he mentioned the CAR-T treatments. I think there's a very interesting example in the Netherlands and in Belgium where actually the industry is working together with academic partners in order to deliver these therapies because there's a capacity issue. So the industry is providing really the sequence for the CAR-Ts, and the hospitals, based on the hospital exemption provision, are developing these CAR-T therapies for different indications in order to allow the access to as many patients as possible. And I think that's a very, very interesting model to pursue, because if you consider the limbal stem cell therapy that I mentioned earlier, this treatment can be achieved with a relatively very low price. At the moment, a few thousands of euros per therapy. Once it is the price of bringing such a therapy through market authorization eventually to the patient results that we need to pay at the end more than 100,000 euro per patient in order to treat them with the therapy that we could have otherwise delivered. So I think creating these ecosystems, fostering this collaboration between industry and academic partners, and cross-border transfer of patients is critical, and that requires that the fund. I think everything here follows the funding. It requires that the funding is available, and I think I will finish with that. The last point is there is lack of funding for translational research. So the funding schemes are arranged as such that when you have a basic research lab, then you can acquire funding for basic research lab. There is a gray zone between the time that it finishes the research and it can be transferred to a patient. And in that zone, there is not a lot of funding available. So then you need to go to the industry. Maybe it's not interesting for the industry. If it is interesting for the industry, they'll take it over for a very low price because you're in such an early stage. So I think that's also very crucial.
Okay, I wanted to come to you on this because I know that one of your gene therapies went through a process, and this was a regional collaboration with the Benelux countries. What did we learn from that?
So, as I mentioned earlier, look, we've had a tremendous amount of learning in real time. I mentioned in our area of disease, where time is neurons, there was a sense of urgency, almost a carpe diem moment to act, where you have patients, again, back families, which we shouldn't lose sight of. So you almost ask yourself, what is my responsibility here to do the right thing? Now, although we believe minor adjustments to existing national procurement frameworks need to happen, national negotiations are better suited downstream. And let me share with you, Billy made a really nice statement earlier which resonated with me, that over-indexing on centralization may hinder innovation. So if we had put all of our efforts behind a centralized procedure around those, we may not have had the opportunity to have day one access in Europe. That means post-EMA approval, day one, we would make the product available and honor the final negotiation with a country. Secondly, we were able to redefine frameworks to pay over time, up to 5 years in some cases. And then where there wasn't an acknowledgement for some of our data, actually allow more outcomes-based agreements. So we cooperated because it was the right thing to do at that time. Now, you know, this may not serve well for every other ATMP and generally not our framework, but at that time it was the right thing to do for the significant pressure in that carpe diem moment.
Thank you. Andre, just on this point, and Billy made a passionate plea, because the other side of this, there's the regional collaboration issue, but there's also this question of, he was talking about these new payment models. And his frustration saying it shouldn't be a choice between this and keeping the lights on. We need a separate fund. We need to treat this. Otherwise, we'll never provide. It will never make those decisions. This goes to the sustainability. Do you think we're doing enough to foster the conversation, the sharing of experiences when it comes to innovative payment models, more risk-sharing based agreements? Can we do more here?
Definitely, and I mean, it's also the Parliament that can take lead. I can see nice synergy with the lessons learned taken from both the COVID and now the war crisis. EU is spelling in the Brussels bubble a lot, and to be honest, the Commission has already done on the industrial side, but not specifically considering too much pharmaceutical, done a lot on the strategic autonomy. So we have plans to be less dependent on other parts of the world, which means we need to have finance to have the capacities here, okay? And the capacities must cover complete value chains. So, for example, I was very happy to hear that you can have a good research, but then, okay, there is a gap, okay? And if the, let's say, pharma company doesn't jump on, we could have a missed opportunity. So, I mean, it's great that we can talk about this, and I think this topic in general covers much more fields, not only transformative therapies, and it's a good, let's say, notice point that we can work on in our plenary debates, for example.
So, in fact, I mean, we're talking a lot today about the specific characteristic of these therapies, but this is one area where the challenge may be different, because here the biggest challenge, of course, is instead of payments for chronic illness, you're doing a one-off higher payment, and that's what's posing the particular difficulty. But you're saying a lot of learnings across different sectors, which I think is really important. In terms of both regional collaborations and in terms of this sharing of new ways of approaching this. Any thoughts, Donato, Simone? I'll go to Donato first and then to Simone this time. Turn it round.
Regional collaboration could be one of the way to link better together different expertise and facilities all over Europe. We were speaking about the lack of research infrastructure distributed all over Europe, which have a common framework that can allow to work together and can solve some very relevant issues, because it is not only, as we were saying, the translation from academy to industry, but it is also the value of that, because we have hundreds and thousands of maybe good therapies or good compounds, good molecules that fail because the basic idea is not demonstrated, but maybe it can be reused, can be rethink to another indication, for example, another therapeutic area. But how can we do this? Maybe we should think about separating research and development from the marketing prices. So research and development is a common universal goal for everybody. So all the stakeholders all together is a public need to develop treatment. So we should focus on the drug development process and therapies, of course, advanced therapies development, and try to find the best way to improve this process. When it is ready for the market is a different thing. It's the moment of the pharma industries, and it is an issue of industrial models is different. But you have already a therapist available and authorized for the patients, and then you can have a different approach. If we don't differentiate this approach, we will lose a lot of innovation in the academic, but not only in the academic field, because of lack of cooperation and collaboration. Also between countries, because you can have one lab in one country and one NUCO in another country, and you are not connected.
Thank you, Simone.
Look, the issue of cooperation and collaboration, particularly in rare diseases, is at the cornerstone of success in the fight against rare diseases. If we weren't to pool knowledge and understanding of what the diseases are, we wouldn't be able to solve any of them. And that has been sort of a mantra for all of this. So we have pushed forward for the regional collaboration, but we want to go further and learning on the challenges that companies have faced when approaching for example, Benelux initiative. What came out as a common denominator was a shared commitment to provide the therapies, and therefore there was a willingness to find an agreement. There is a lot of things to be perfected in that sense, because if I see now there is another therapy that has been discussed for metachromatic leukodystrophy, which is a much rarer disease with about 50 patients per year in Europe, gone through Benelux, and now the Netherlands has reached an agreement. They are providing according to their national regulation, but in Belgium and in Ireland that's not happening. So here we need to work around that and expanding it, because if we are talking about 50 patients per year, we should be able to provide the therapy to everyone, no matter where they live in Europe.
Thank you very much indeed. I will come out to all of you shortly, but there's one other issue I want to come back to, and really it's something Simone talked about right at the beginning when you were talking about centres of excellence. And this is one of the calls from the Charter is for improvements in infrastructure and more access to enable cross-border patient access to ATMPs. The Commission is not seeming minded to reopen the directive. So in light of that, what can and should the Commission do, or be done more generally, to ensure better collaboration, cross-border collaboration, when patients need to travel to another country? Because as you pointed out, particularly with those very rare diseases, there will only be maybe one centre of excellence in the whole of Europe, maybe. So what do we do here? And this does come back to a legislative issue. Do you feel, Andre, we need to continue to sort of knock at that door of saying, you need to look at this again, you need to look at the rules again, or are there things we can do without changing the directive better than we're doing now?
Absolutely, yes. And it has been debated in the previous panel that simply there are some fields, and transformative therapies belongs to those fields, that the progress can be so, let's say, fast that you need to do revisions basically continually. I mean, I respect the European Commission, but I would recommend they have 27 commissioners. One of them could be commissioner for quality management, and maybe as it is in the private companies, and then maybe this will run automatically. So yes, indeed, knock on the door, of course, coming with concrete proposals, communicate. There are a number of tools in the European Parliament, but of course in the private ways between the Commission and the business. So if we feel that there is a real ground for introduce changes, let's ask for it, and if we are not listened to, let's ask more loudly. That's it.
Thank you. Simone, I wanted to come back to you because is there more that we can do to exploit what is in the directive, and what sort of mechanisms do we need if we are to facilitate cross-border access without a change in the rules?
We don't necessarily need to change immediately the directive nor the regulation on social security, because the regulation on social security allows, with the S2 form, to actually access treatment abroad. But this is a route that is not very well known. even amongst the patient organization. It's not well known amongst the national contact points that are appointed in each healthcare system to address where potentially a patient could go. The ramification of the difference in national healthcare system and navigating them doesn't help neither the patient nor the clinician to address the patient in the right direction. Thirdly, there are experiences, and I think we have one in the Charter, that show that with the use of the S2 form and the regulation, it is possible to transfer the patient. What is needed is support to the patient to make that travel. And here, European funding would be much appreciated to support at least that. We don't have to go through additional regulation to have bilateral or multilateral agreement in terms of how to access those treatments. And certainly we don't need a new regulation to inform patient national contact points, clinicians through the European reference network, much better embedded in national healthcare system to allow for patients to travel and access the therapies they need.
Thank you very much indeed. Very clear agenda there.
I agree on what colleagues already said, but I would like also to add that we have also an issue with patients coming from outside Europe. This is also our responsibility, for sure, especially from the neighboring countries. And also that the areas have been a successful innovation in the European research, maybe more on care than in research strategies, but they should grow, so they should increase the number of centers, in my opinion, and they should increase the collaboration, because they have not funding to do anything, and so they are, let's say, like the center of excellence, but they have not enough resources to develop better methodologies and treatments together. They work as benchmarking, the best available all around, but not developing innovation together, not enough.
Morte before, and then I'm going to come out to all of you.
I would just add, look, again, guided by the right principles, do the right thing. If you have a very rare disease and you have a few centers of excellence, like my colleagues have stated, we support cross-border care with the right standard of care, but most appropriately as well with the safeguard rails for the follow-up care. So almost like what happens afterwards, once you've had the intervention, do you have the appropriate management and the support staff and the team to ensure that the patient has that network around them? So
and that's tricky, because they will travel home again from that centre of excellence. How do you support them long distance?
And I get it, right? This is a temptation to have the most shiniest kit in the world, or in the space of rare disease, a progression like we heard from Luke earlier, that Star Trek moment becomes a reality. And, we find that the patients, are all in. We find that the physicians, but then we need to also put the guardrails in place on what does that aftercare look like, and that management.
Thank you very much. More.
I agree with everything that's been said, and I would just like to add a small comment about the role of registries also in this area. So in the Netherlands, we have the RD 5000 registry, which is a registry for patients with inherited retinal diseases. So based on statistics, we calculated there should be 5,000 of these patients around in the Netherlands. And in order to capture this data, anticipating that more and more advanced therapies will become available to these patients, we've set up a registry where all these patients are registered, their genetic information, if it's known, it's registered. The clinical information, if known, it's registered. So that means we are building an infrastructure how we can reach these patients. And I think if we had multinational registries or European registries at least to have this information, we'll know how to reach the patients once something is going to become available. So you can anticipate it with registries. The second part about registries that I would like to mention in this, I think one of the major benefits of registries is that they create networks when people learn from each other, when people who are delivering these therapies to their patients can learn from their experience, share their experience, and improve. And it allows also some benchmarking, so you can compare yourself to others and see if what you are doing, adjusted to the patients that you are treating, is delivering the same results. So I think in both areas, registries can also help this type of collaboration.
Thank you. Indeed. Yes, please.
A big issue because ERLs don't have registries.
No, that's not
yes, Simone.
There are plenty of registry, but not every
No, but they are fragmented. They are different registries, not interoperable. So
you want to respond.
You are
Giovanni. No, Giovanni. I mean, I understand the issue. Donato, sorry. You also represented Giovanni.
Yes.
Sorry, that's
you have to be a bit psychic today.
There are several registries. It is true that they not have been established all at the same time. There are some ERN that are more advanced than others. If you look at the metabolic disorders, much more advanced. Neuromuscular is much more advanced. But in bone disorders, they're bringing it together. And in other areas, they are building it. It's a bit of a sweeping statement to say they don't have registry. We're building them. But there is a need for reducing the fragmentation. That I agree with you. And there is a need for funding around common data sets that can allow, in the ERNI, for instance, that registry is connected with the rest of Europe, and therefore making meaningful use of those data, not only for research, but even though going beyond to reimbursement issues. What are the outcomes? What are the measures that we are developing? Another point, sorry, before I forget. Yep. Patient-reported outcomes measure, that is an issue that needs to be addressed in terms of the flexibility of the regulatory system, because not always the measures that we have capture the advancement in the therapies and what they do to the quality of life of the patient. Patients are resorting to develop their own measures, but they are not adequately and fast enough adopted by regulators and HTA to measure the efficacy of the treatment.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, I'm going to come to the front and then I'll come to the back. Please, Gilles wants to speak. Eleni, but I tell you what I'm going to do. Gilles, and then I'm going to the back, someone who hasn't spoken, Eleni, and then I'll come back to you. Brief ones if you would. Gilles.
Yeah, very few. Just on cross-border, there is a loophole. Cross-border directive, excellent, and no need for change. There is an instrument, the European Reference Network, to implement the cross-border, 24 of them. They are not funded. Not only the registries, but the activities. And why? Because these are the member states who really need to consider funding the reference network. And we have a loophole, initiative from Europe, which are excellent, but then the remit of health is at the member state level, and the member state level does not invest into the reference network. And I think this is something that it really needs to be addressed if we want this reference network to deliver registry data, but also care for the patient traveling from a country to another one.
Thank you. There was one over there, please. That's it.
All right. I'm Kasper Rucinski, SMA Europe. It was mentioned about newborn screening. I wanted to come back to the issue of newborn screening. Especially, I can see there from here the surname to the right mention new generation sequencing and genome sequencing as a possible method of diagnosing or actually population screening. I would be hesitant to go that way, because newborn screening opens a new generation sequencing opens a Pandora box of problems, of various problems that will take a long time to address, including the capacity to screen, to sequence, let's say, 15,000 genomes a day in Europe, or acceptance and so on. What I fear is that will overshadow what can be done now. It's a very attractive method, but for the distant future. For now, there are methods that can be implemented traditional screening methods. But what we are seeing now in spinal muscular atrophy, but in a range of other disorders. A child born, let's say, in Slovenia is tested at birth for 40 disorders. A child born in Italy, 34 disorders. Here in Belgium, 17 disorders. But a child born a short drive away, a short drive from here in France, is tested for 6 disorders only. So we can see the impact on the life. So my question would be, when reading the Charter, we see the ambition is to support or facilitate experience sharing. I'm sorry, I'm not seeing it now because my laptop also complied with the energy crisis. All right. Why not trying such an ambitious document, such a vision? Why not to go for full harmonization of newborn screening? Okay. It's just not a medical procedure.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank
I'm going to take a few more and then I'll come back. Eleni, I promise, brief one if you would, please. And I saw another hand over here somewhere. Yeah, Leila wants to come back in. Anyone else, just so I know how many I'm squeezing in? Okay, Eleni and then Leila.
I will keep it brief, being conscious of time. So Donato started with something very clear, that no body has taken leadership, and we need leadership. And the best body to do that is actually the European Parliament. So we have in our hands a charter compiled by so many stakeholders from all the areas. And what are the next steps? Because we would really like, as patients, to see a known initiative report of the European Parliament on the matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Leila.
Thank you. I would like to hear panels' views/reflections on digital health. And I'll make it very specific because digital health is very big. So we keep on talking about the long-term follow-up of the ATMP for good reasons, the patients. So what is the merit and gravity of the digital health data seen from HTA perspectives? Are there any opportunities we are missing? So the wearables and all, because these patients will be monitored for many, many, many years. Will that data be considered credible?
Thank you very much. I'm going to take these quite whistle-stop because we don't have long. Own initiative report from the Parliament. Andre.
Many thanks for giving us a task. And I'm not a type of politician that promises, but that it will happen, but it will be a very logical step. And I believe it's a sufficient assurance.
And another one I think that really is for you, this question of harmonised newborn screening. And I mean, is it, I don't think the EU can do it, can they?
Jackie.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, because we're speaking about the leadership. What can the European Parliament do?
Yeah, hang on a minute. Hang on. I just want to deal with the questions from the audience, and we don't have long, please. Yeah, on the whether we could make harmonised newborn screening mandatory. We couldn't, can we? Not something
I have no idea. Thank you.
I think it may be beyond the EU's competence, but we'll get back to you on that one. And then there was the question of data, digital health data. Can anyone pick up more?
Yeah, I think also there's a big issue of fragmentation and a lot of regulations that address it. So that we have the European health data space, where we'll have a regulation about the artificial intelligence. We have the GDPR, and there come a lot of questions. So everybody on the one hand recognize the importance of collecting this data. I think that we can agree that it's important to do it in an independent way, that we will capture long-term data, that we will have standardized data sets, that we will capture the patient perspectives. We want to have HTA, everything. We want to have everything, but how are we going to do it? Who is going to pay for it? Who is going to make sure that these systems are sustainable? And how can we use this data for research, considering also privacy issues? So I think if we really want to achieve this, I think the MEP recognized one lacuna in the funding for translational research. This is another very important lacuna. We all recognize the importance, but we lack the tools in order to achieve it.
Donato, you wanted to make a burning point.
Just 1 minute. Yes, we lost a great occasion with the Next Generation EU to put health and life science research at the forefront, because we took 2 pillars, digital innovation and green revolution. The third one should be health and research in life sciences. So this is a new approach.
I think you've just answered my final question, unless you have another key next step, because I wanted to go back, and the same question I asked the first panel, and as I say, accepting here, key central tenet of this charter is that it needs to be taken holistically. All the recommendations are equally important, and therefore I'm not going to ask you for a priority, but I'm going to go straight down the line. So I'm going to jump over Andre and come to Andre last as our host today, before I give the floor to our closing speaker. For each of you, a key next step to ensure that we really can meet these challenges we've been discussing and deliver a really effective response that means more Lukes will be able to stand up in front of us in the years to come and tell such heartwarming and inspiring stories. More.
I think two aspects are critical, I think, from all our discussions today. One is the harmonization that is really needed in all the different aspects that we've discussed. And two, I think, in every discussion, if you want to make sure there is success, you need to follow the money. So the funding needs to be aligned with what we want to achieve. So it has to be harmonized in terms of regulation and legislation, and the funding should follow and make it possible to achieve these goals.
Thank you very much. Donato.
Okay, it brings to focusing on unmet needs. This is the real priority, in my opinion, and this goes towards rare diseases and pediatric research, which is the real way to boosting research and innovation and avoiding that the maximum efforts will go in other sectors.
Thank you very much. Simone.
The Charter reflects the approach that we take, that to improve the access, the development and access to therapies, we need to take it as a life cycle perspective, and this is very important. But secondly, and maybe more importantly, we need to follow the money, as it was said before, but Europe needs to take the leadership. There is no way, there is absolutely every possible way to marry focusing on unmet patient need and developing research. And we need to adequately fund it across Europe and create really the leadership that we as a continent can bring forward, particularly in rare diseases across the world.
Thank you.
So I'm going to end with some further optimism around, I think, our start of the journey in the AAV space should give a reason for hope and belief that this is possible. And we've seen that with manufacturing scale, and we've seen that directly with patients and reimbursement in Europe. So I think that is something to be proud of unashamedly. What I think needs to happen, and I also look at the Charter holistically, I think it's a great pivot moment for Europe, is to how do we converge HTA thinking earlier with regulatory thinking. So it's not about access. I know that sounds provocative. It's about uptake, right? The word can be used very generically, but frankly, after regulatory approval, it's too late. And I say this in the ATMP space because the world moves very fast. Our understanding moves very fast, and we have to try to translate access way early on so you don't get downstream delays.
Seeing lots of nodding from our first panel, Teso. I think you're singing to the same hymn sheet on this. Andre, a final thought from you.
So firstly, many thanks to all of you for a great debate, physically, first time, and what we need to do, what will be the follow-up. We need to maintain the format. We need to have this multi-stakeholder debate and focus now on transferring of the policy goals into concrete legislation proposal, and at the same time doing maximum. And once again, thank you for the proposal to promote the topic as such among policymakers, among the Brussels bubble, and of course among citizens.
Thank you very much. And before I introduce our closing speaker, who'll talk more about where we go from here, will you join me in thanking this panel very much indeed for a splendid debate. You may return. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Always a pleasure. Thank you, Andre. Great. So we are coming to the end of our session, and as I mentioned earlier, we will be serving drinks afterwards. And if you can say and celebrate this moment, the launch of the Charter after so many months of hard work by so many stakeholders working together, we would be very pleased to have you with us. But it's now to draw some conclusions from our discussion and talk a little bit more about next steps. We've been talking about next steps in all our panels. I'm delighted to welcome Tomislav Sokol from the Transform MEP Interest Group. Tomislav, so good to have you with us. Over to you for some closing reflections.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I'm afraid, I'm sorry I wasn't able to be here before, but I had 5 events today on healthcare, different events, so it's hard to get to everything. Yeah, definitely. But no, I'm glad, because actually one of them was about the revision of orphan drugs regulations, so it's also connected with topic here. So I'm glad that you invited me to give some closing remarks. Thank you for being here. I think this is a very good and particularly timely event, because now we are in the process and we are waiting for the proposal of the Commission for the revision of the pharmaceutical legislation, and ATMPs I think will be the crucial aspect of that. So from what I heard and what I saw, I heard the different very good arguments. I think one of the main takeaways is that definitely all stakeholders should be involved in this process, especially healthcare professionals and patient organizations, also to put pressure on the Commission, but also to take part in the whole process and actually to give your insights and your proposals and your suggestions. More concretely, when we speak of ATMPs, now we have the legal framework that we have. Of course, we are limited in possibilities, so we cannot regulate everything. There were some questions about can we make some things mandatory on the national level? My answer is no, unfortunately, because these things are national competence. So organization and funding and management of healthcare and determining what is funded from the state budget and what is not is a national competence. What EU can do is support national policies. Of course, that doesn't mean that EU cannot do anything. And one of the main areas where EU can do a lot and has done a lot is to facilitate this whole research and innovation ecosystem and to facilitate the creation of introduction of new advanced medicines on European level. Of course, we know we have EMA, which is the main institution responsible for making evaluations of new medical technologies. Of course, the final decision is then made by the Commission, but to put something on the market, EMA is crucial, and procedures which are done by EMA are crucial. Of course, the pricing and reimbursement part that was also mentioned here is again primarily a national competence, and this is something that will remain as it is. But still, what I want to say is when we speak about what should be the priorities, in my opinion. So first, now with the revision of pharma legislation, we should really make sure that we stimulate research and innovation. So, which means also engaging with the industry, even though some people in the parliament don't really like that. But I was part of I lived in a country, in Croatia, which was part of the communist ideology, which was run by the socialists, and then we learned that the only way to create new products is to have a market. So we need a market. We need to have private initiative. We need to have industry facilitate research innovation as much as possible. So that is one side. There are various ways to do that. For instance, I think one good idea is to have different periods for market exclusivity from different types of medical products to try to stimulate additionally, especially really innovative medicines, which are really offering something completely new, especially for ultra rare diseases. That is one approach. Also using real world evidence more when making evaluations of new technologies, etc. So I think that we can do a lot on here, but the crucial thing is to really facilitate and incentivize research and innovation. I think it's crucial, especially if we want, since we are not alone in the world, and of course if we provide too much obstacles and too much regulatory pressure and upon the private sector, then this private sector will go to China, US, etc., and then we'll have the counter effect to what we actually want to achieve. Of course, so first thing is to facilitate and incentivize research and innovation, but the second is also to enable access. And here there are different instruments at our disposal, even though we have limitations. As I said, pricing and reimbursement decisions are made by the member states, but I think we can do a lot. Unfortunately, HTA regulation was a missed opportunity. I'm saying this openly because I think the whole idea of the HTA regulation was to substitute 27 national systems of HTA with one European, which will make it much easier and much faster to introduce new conduct health technology assessment of new and innovative medical technologies. However, because of the opposition from some member states, now instead of having one substituting 27 systems, now we have the 28 systems. So we have the 27 national system plus, in addition, the European system, because there is no clear legal obligation upon the member states to recognize what has been done and implement what has been done on European level. So this is definitely a problem. Also, one area, as I mentioned, pricing and reimbursement. That is, when you speak of access, that is very important. Unfortunately, the directive that we have at the European level is 33 years old and has never been amended, because again, some member states always opposed to that and always prevented this from happening. This transparency directive, which regulates the procedures for making decisions on reimbursement of new technologies by the national health insurance institutions, I think should be completely revised. I think we need a new directive. We need to have much clearer principles which should guide the pricing and reimbursement decisions. I think that we should have much more provisions about the transparency of these national provisions, because this is one of the reasons why we have so many differences in different member states. And the major problem here, of course, is because of these different regulations, different practices in different member states, etc., that health inequalities and access to ATMPs is so much diverse between different member states. So I think we really have to change this. I think we have to provide additional funding for the member states as well, especially for medicines for rare diseases. I think there are possibilities there. Actually, was a rapporteur on how to use European Union funds to reduce inequalities which exist in healthcare. So I think that we can do a lot here. But also we have to see what we can do on European level, especially since the prices which are offered to different member states of medicinal products are also not the same. One idea is to maybe try to copy the system of joint procurement of vaccinations and to extend this to expensive medicines for rare diseases. That is one idea. The other idea is to try to adjust prices to economic possibilities and economic situations of individual member states. These are things that need to be addressed and discussed. But I'm glad that we are currently in this process of really speaking about this. And of course, one last thing that I wanted to mention is data. As some of you may or may not know, we have the proposal for regulation in European health data space. I was recently appointed rapporteur on this file, and I think this is also a very important piece of legislation, because the whole idea of this regulation is to make it possible to use the data from all member states for primary use by the medical professionals, but also for secondary use, which means for research, innovation, etc. And I think if we are able to implement this, if we are able to make this data interoperable so that it can be exchanged between different member states, then the whole new horizon of for possibilities for clinical studies, for research projects, etc., opens up for us. So if we make this happen, we will get much more medical data that we have at our disposal now. Of course, this is I was just recently appointed rapporteur. We haven't still started the real process of making the draft report. We still don't have all the shadow rapporteurs, but I'm confident and I'm optimistic that in the first half of next year we'll have this regulation, at least the Parliament's position on this regulation, and once it is enacted, that we will be able really to use data from different member states much more than we have been able now. So to sum up, I think we have a lot of possibilities, a lot of things we can do on European level, foster research and innovation, but also think how to facilitate access. And if we are able to create a real balance between those two, I think that really we can make a difference, and we can make ATMPs much more accessible than they are now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Tomislav. we can do a lot. I think what I've heard more than anything else today is how urgent it is to act, and that instead of concentrating on what we can't do, there's a lot we can do, and our panels have been very eloquent, and as have our MEPs from the interest group in underlining where we can really make a difference. That is all we have time for today. Just to mention that these are all issues that the Transform Alliance will come back to in 2023, which promises to be another hot year for this issue. In the meantime, you can follow and engage with the work of Transform on Twitter and on LinkedIn. So please do stay with this debate, stay with this journey. And as I mentioned right at the beginning, we have an expression in English which is to sing for your supper. Well, you're not going to get supper, and I haven't made you sing. But for all the hard work from our panel, from all of you, your contributions to what has been an excellent debate, I invite you now to join us, if you can, for a drink. The drinks are served here, so you don't have to go far. Thank you very much for being with us today, and goodbye.